there's gonna be a new Super Smash Bros. Game down the road at some point, and as is tradition, that means new Pokemon in Smash. What if we could expand our horizons beyond the usual starter or legendary from the newest generation territory a bit though? What if it could be anything? Say, another Pokemon Trainer 2.0 that didn't need to just pull from the original 151. That's what we're looking at today, ranking how well every Pokemon would function as a Smash candidate, or at least the ones I haven't already covered, because this is the second video in a series. Now, technically speaking, you don't even really need to watch the two videos in order, it's just that you may have some positions spoiled for you if you start with this one and you decide you want to continue with the first one later. Other than that, let's get into it. I'm going to start off by just addressing a couple of comments from the last video. A lot of people said that Echo Fighter was being thrown around a bit too liberally, considering the changes between like Charmeleon and Charizard, for example. And you know what? That's fair. Semi-Clone was kind of more the idea I had in my head, but the way that Ultimate uses the term Echo Fighter is probably too strict for a lot of these, so we'll go more like this. I penalized Darmanitan and Galarian Darmanitan for the same reasons, that being that the form switching thing is a cool concept, except their base form is fine and their transformed state can't move, which obviously isn't applicable to Smash. I forgot that the Snowman form actually can move though, that's my bad. By far my most controversial placement, I made what I thought was a relatively innocuous comment, why would you pick Grovyle when you can pick Sceptile? And oh boy, the Mystery Dungeon fans did not like that. I know Grovyle's a character in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, I'm aware, and people are giving comments like, well, you could have Grovyle represent the Mystery Dungeon franchise in Smash, which I don't really get why you would do that over all the other Pokemon content. Don't get me wrong, purely from a visual perspective, I love Grovyle's design. I may prefer it over Sceptile. I still think Sceptile is a way better Smash candidate, but I got so much pushback on this one that, you know what? There you go. Grovyle gets his own tier just for you. The other thing I got bullied about was my pronunciation of Gardevoir. I'm still not convinced I'm wrong. It looks like a French woman. It's got the bob haircut. Gardevoir? Gardevoir sounds right to me. Calling Escavalier Escavalier. Okay, that one's on me. It's supposed to be a Cavalier, I get it. As for all the people saying that it should be upstaging Beedrill, not the other way around, keep pushing. I'll go lower. I also got some comments saying I was being too harsh on the floating Pokemon because Bowser Jr. is already in the game, and that's a pretty important thing to clear up. For the record, I don't like it on Bowser Jr. either. I'm not changing my philosophy there. Since I made the first half of this video, I finally had the chance to sit down and play all of the Scarlet and Violet DLC, so let's talk about Ogerpon here. Yeah, I'm just gonna say it right away, this is an S tier. Not only is it a pretty charming story in the DLC, but mechanically it just functions so well. A small sword fighter who can equip different masks to unlock various elemental powers. This is essentially just the Majora's Mask Youngling free work everyone's been asking for in Smash. You could have a Shulk-style Monado system thing, except you just stay in the form as long as you want to. So the fire one is more powerful and the water one's more defensive, and you can change not only some individual stats of the character, but also how certain moves function. Ivy Cudgel in particular, its signature move, and a lot of the time characters' signature moves get worked into special moves of some kind, which you could do. It's also just perfectly well set up to be a forward smash if you wanted to take that route. You've got Horn Leech for a life drain style move, always a big fan of those, and maybe in your grass form that one's more powerful. Not how it actually works in Pokemon, but considering the default form is the grass form, you know, reasonable translation. Great place to put Spiky Shield, maybe not as a full-on counter, but kind of a move you hold up in front of yourself, and if your opponent runs into it, they get bounced back with damage. Could be a really good showcase for Gen 9's Terastallization mechanic and interacts with it in a way that very few Pokemon do. Yeah, that one's pretty free. The other big legendaries of Kitakami, you've got the Loyal 3 and then Pesharunt. First off, just starting with their base Pokemon identities, I like the concept a lot more than the execution with these. I'm just a sucker for the poison type, is one of my favorite Pokemon types, so having a poison legendary and multiple poison legendaries at that are all bundled together is cool. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm super in love with any of their particular designs though. Monkey Dory, I always just think like a Family Guy character when I look at this. Okie dokie. Okay, props for the name. Even by Pokemon standards, it's looking a bit, mascot-y for my taste, each their own. And then Pheasantipity, who probably has my favorite visual design of the trio, also is by far the most awkward to actually try and fit into Smash. Birds are always going to be a problem. Monkey Dory is not awful. Okidogi actually works pretty well. These bundled legendaries are tricky though. I don't really want to separate them too much, and thankfully there is actually sort of a lore thing going on here. They're all being controlled by Pesharunt. That's why they all have those toxic chains on them. And Pesharunt, despite being a cool Pokemon, you know, the concept of a villain hiding inside a piece of dessert is fun. It's also really awkward to try and fit into Smash by itself, so I think what you need to do is you need to combine these all together. Have kind of an evil Pokemon trainer thing going on where Pesherunt is the one who's out there on the field with one of these Pokemon at any given time, and then most of the attacks are coming from whichever one is out and is being controlled at the moment, but Pesherunt can also launch some attacks of its own, and they're both hittable. Maybe kind of a reverse Rosalina and Luma situation where the puppet character is much bigger. It's kind of awkward and unwieldy, and realistically this should probably be a B tier, but it's getting my bias bump up into A. I really like the concept of this group of poison legendaries, it's fun. And then the other Kitakami legendary, Blood Moon Ursaluna. This one works fairly well as a heavyweight design. I like the fact that it stands upright. It definitely gives it an edge over the base form Ursaluna, just a more compatible shape. Its signature move, Blood Moon, could be pretty directly translated into Smash as a projectile that you set, and then after a delay it fires. You could even maybe make it so that it tracks opponents before it fires. That may be a bit over the top. It would obviously need some testing, but it is in line with Mind's Eye, Blood Moon Ursaluna's signature ability, which adds all sorts of caveats that make it easier to hit targets. Add on something like Headlong Rush being used as a really cool dash attack option. Yeah, fun heavyweight potential, A tier. Base form Ursaluna isn't awful, and in Pokemon Legends Arceus, it was the new Ursaring form on the block. Didn't really get that much time to shine. Quadrupeds are allowed, but this one's definitely just nowhere near as interesting. And then Ursaring, you may think at first glance it might work as an Echo Fighter, but it stands so upright compared to Blood Moon Ursaluna, who's very hunched over, so you would need to basically change every animation. I don't think that's worth the effort for, again, just a much more bland Pokemon. And yeah, same thing for Teddiursa. Breloom. You know, I originally wrote this one off a little bit just because of how stubby its arms are, but if you look at its animations in the modern games, it can actually stretch them out. And we're not talking mid-min levels here. Oh god, no, not another one of those. No, we're just talking about a Pokemon that can functionally use arm attacks in ways that would just be more interesting, if anything, than having standard arms. You could make it like a powder-based fighter, have multiple different status effects. That's a big part of its identity in the Pokemon games. It's got claws that it can slash with, it's got a tail, it's got the big mushroom head that it could bash people with. Relatively well-known and well-liked Pokemon. It offers a lot of utility both in competitive and casual playthroughs. Yeah, honestly, as a prize S tier, I really like this one. No Echo Fighters going on here though. Amoonguss, another powder-based mushroom Pokemon. This one is more awkward. It does have the properly stubby arms. It's kind of a fun shape, you know, being able to punch people with a couple of shieldish arms. That's neat, if nothing else. But yeah, it's really not a good shape. It's just really difficult to picture this one moving around a Smash stage. I'm actually going to say that Brute Bonnet, its Paradox iteration, works better because it has proper legs that it can walk around on, and it's got a tail that it can swipe with, and it's still got all of the sort of core attributes of Amoonguss. It's still kind of awkward and by no means the most in-demand Paradox form, but you know, still a relatively functional Pokemon. Amoonguss's body shape is just too different to work as an Echo Fighter, but that's okay. I think Brute Bonnet just outclasses it. And obviously that applies to both of them. Another one whose body shape almost doesn't work, Dragapult, but if you look at how it actually functions in the Pokemon games, how it's animated, it does work. That upright stance isn't just maintained in its illustration, it's a real fan favorite, this stealth glider concept that has baby variants of itself being fired as projectiles. You could maybe use them like Snake's Nikita, but with way more control and more actions to take, kind of an almost puppet character concept, but not quite fully committing. Dragon Ghost is obviously an incredibly cool type combination, I barely need to say that, and it's got a giant tail that it could use for a bunch of attacks, could bash people with its head. Not an incredibly natural fit, more of a B tier, but again bumped up to A for cool factor. Dracloak, you know, I could kind of see it as an Echo Fighter. It fires off one Dreepy instead of two, that's the big distinguishing factor, and then obviously it's smaller and faster. I think that works pretty well. By the time we're getting down to Dreepy though, it doesn't fire anything, and you could say, oh yeah, well that's the Echo Fighter difference in that case, but I think being able to fire off something is a big part of why I'm interested in this Pokemon in the first place. And while we're talking about puppet characters, Kangaskhan. So default Kangaskhan is not really that interesting. This is a character where I think you have to go with the Mega if you're going to use them, because Kangaskhan doesn't really change all that much as far as Megas go, except for the fact that the baby is now fighting independently, which you could obviously make like a heavyweight Rosalina kind of design, or maybe you could have Kangaskhan alternate back and forth between the original and Mega forms. That's not really something I've proposed on other keep them in the Mega forms I've talked about, because usually I just hold off Megas for final smashes and stuff like that, and I'm not really getting into them. And the few Pokemon where I've said, yes, I want you in your Mega form because it's more interesting, I just have said keep them there. Kangaskhan's the only one where I think they flow pretty well between both of them. She could keep the pup safe in her pouch or send it out, but if the pup takes damage, the entire character takes damage, obviously a big distinguishing factor from Rosalina. I honestly really like that, another S tier. And you know what, I'll put both forms up here. You don't need to take this approach, you could easily just do the Mega form, but I think being able to choose between puppet character or no puppet character is a cool direction. Another nurturing Pokemon, at least, Leavanny. Nurturing babies, it's kind of its whole identity, and you could, if you really wanted to, make a moveset based on again, kind of a puppet design, bringing out the younger forms to kind of fight for you. In this case, it would be much more about protecting them. It appeared in the show, so it obviously gets the bump there. I guess I'll collectively let him slip into B. It's not exciting to me, but there is a clear vision there. That is part of what I'm looking for. Goldeen and Sea King, our first classic floppy fish of the video. They don't work on land, I'm sorry. Magikarp should absolutely be right beside him, but I'm going to give it comedy tier instead because you know full well that if they were going to try and pull a fast one with some fish Pokemon, it's definitely going to be Magikarp, no questions asked. As for Gyarados, this is probably going to be a bit controversial because Gyarados is one of the most fan favorite Pokemon of all time. It doesn't work in Smash at all. Yes, it's a flying type, so it avoids the floppy fish problem. It does function outside of water, but it's way too long and you would need to shrink it down way too much. That aerial serpentine thing it does just does not lend itself to Smash properly. I don't want it scaled down. I want it to maintain its status as this giant, awesome looking creature. I'm going F tier. I want to reiterate, yes, technically you can cook up a moveset for any character in Smash. I can think of some ways you could try and really force Gyarados in there, but it just feels wrong to me. I'd much rather let it maintain its cool status in Pokemon. Onix and Steelix are going in the same camp. Just let them be these huge monsters. It's fine. Speaking of huge monsters, Dondozo, the newest whale Pokemon, and okay, yeah, it's technically not a whale, more of a catfish, but who are we kidding? It's a whale and it's going in whale tier with the other whales. Tatsugiri is way too small and frankly not interesting by itself. Its only significance is its relationship with Dondozo. Now, its functionality in doubles play where it can leap into Dondozo's mouth and issue orders from there, that is really cool. I like the mechanic in Pokemon, but as far as bringing it into Smash, you need to start with just bringing Dondozo in, which I don't think you can do. And then we have Satitan, Scarlet and Violet's other whale that's somehow less of a whale despite literally being the Terra whale Pokemon. This one has legs. It can move around the stage just fine. It's a bit funny to think about it jumping around on platforms, but not impossible. It's really big, but I don't think we're quite talking about a Wailord kind of scenario here, and it's also just proportions that I think would generally scale down at least reasonably. I'm still pretty hesitant on it, but I will give it a tentative C tier because it is kind of cool to think about. Looking at D tier though, it kind of feels like it maybe belongs in there. You know what I'll do instead? I'll take the upper tier D candidates, which would be Hitmonlee and Goldango, and move them up. That feels a bit better. As for Satotl, yeah, I think you can make a clone out of that. Ampharos. You know what I like about this one? Its tail kind of naturally lends itself to a tipper mechanic. That's a cool concept. It's not totally unique, not even totally unique among the Pokemon, but leaning into that direction a bit more, I could see that being fun. It's got a head that it could whip around on a long neck, but not an outrageously long, unwieldy neck. You could attack with arms and legs still. Proportions are all pretty solid. Yeah, A tier. Flaffy works really well as an Echo Fighter. Mareep, not so much. Abomasnow is in kind of a tricky spot for me because such a huge part of its identity is setting up snow or hail in previous generations, and I'm harsh on weather-based Pokemon if that's all they offer, but Abomasnow, it's not. A heavyweight Yeti kind of fighter, that's cool. One that also brings grass moves to the table. Now we're actually really talking. You could have vines grow out of those buds on its back to help out with all sorts of things. Could be another good candidate for some health sapping mechanics. You can still have it surround itself with snow and ice, maybe with moves like Blizzard and Icy Wind. They're just used more like projectiles because I don't want it just running around with like a snow cloud above its head or anything like that, right? But you could definitely fit some of that identity in there in a way that still feels appropriate for the Smash environment. A tier. And Snover you probably could make work as an Echo Fighter, a smaller version of the heavyweight. That's always fun, but not super interesting to me. Tangrowth is a very similar concept in a lot of ways. The grass where you could have vines grow out and stuff like that, the long floppy arms, but it doesn't have ice powers associated with it. It's upstaged. And then Tangela isn't really an Echo Fighter. Let's talk about the Gen 6 starters, beginning I guess with the Greninja line considering he's already in Smash. Frogadier, honestly, really good Echo Fighter candidate. It already looks quite a bit like Greninja. Yeah, it doesn't have the same tongue scarf, but Greninja doesn't really do all that many attacks with its tongue, and any that are, that bubble scarf? I don't know what that is. Subs in just fine. Yeah, it's good stuff. Froakie, not as big a fan, and Greninja is already so small, I think it is the lowest character to the ground in the entire game. There's a really strict limit on how much smaller you can actually go. Then we get to Chestnut, and this entire line is just not my favorite of the starters, but I've got to admit, as far as Smash potential goes, there is something here. It's another excellent spiky shield candidate, and it could attack with its back spikes in general, kind of like how Bazzer used to do a lot more often in his Smash moves. I actually miss that. You know, throw it in for your body slam clams and stuff like that. Just a big tanky grass guy. Not nearly as interesting as some of the starters, and I'm certainly not giving it any personal bias, but yeah, okay, A tier. Chespin. Not only is it not very interesting as an Echo Fighter in Smash, but it's also just not my favorite starter design to begin with. It's too busy and looks like a goober. Compared to Quilladin though, a masterpiece of modern art. What the hell happened here? Chespin, nothing special. Get Quilladin's goofy ass out of here. And then there's Delphox, which I know a lot of people are down on. They don't really like this final evolution for some reason. I think it's really cool. You've got Meowscarada as the kind of trickster stage magician, and then you've got Delphox as the actual proper sorcerer. I could see Psybeam being used as kind of a long-range take on Mewtwo's confusion. Mystical Fire, as it works in Pokemon, reduces an opponent's special attack stat. You know, there's obviously no direct parallel, but I think the sort of closest analog I've found throughout the two is taking special attack to mean projectile usage. So I think it could be really cool to adapt that circle animation that it does directly from Pokemon, and then that circle is a reflector, and then afterwards it fires a projectile, which gives off a bit of a similar vibe. It's a projectile move that also has anti-projectile properties. Would be a great Pokemon to put something like Fire Spin into, again adapting that sort of circular fluid motion, which could also pop up in its normals quite a bit. And then Braixen, which the Pokemon fanbase seems to prefer overall for some reason. Yeah, this one obviously works. Hell, it was the candidate for Pokken. Very different energy, much more aggressive and agile, but I see it. Not much Echo Fighter potential there, but I'm giving Delphox an S. And because I don't really have a problem with it, and I guess out of respect, I'll put Braixen up there too. Fennekin is a really cool starter design, but obviously doesn't even remotely work as an Echo Fighter, and I just don't really think it's particularly suitable to be, for example, stage 1 of a new Pokemon trainer or something like that. The thin quadruped design with the big head is just a bit awkward. Excelgor, another ninja from the same generation as Greninja, who is just, I'm sorry, drastically outclassed. The body type is worse. Greninja is one of the most popular Pokemon of all time. In a vacuum, you could kind of make it work, but I'm hesitant to put too much of the same archetype of Pokemon in Smash considering how many there are, and it's upstaged by Greninja so much it's not even funny. Golurk. This one has some interesting stuff going on, starting with its abilities here. So it's got No Guard to guarantee hits, and Iron Fist that powers up punch moves. So a big punching ghost ground thing with some unblockable moves on it, that could be a really cool basis for a character. Then you get into the Pokedex entries, and there's some pretty wild lore going on with these guys. They talk about it flying across the sky at Mach speeds, potentially to do with a perpetual motion machine inside it, and firing energy beams as a defense mechanism for ancient castles. I don't know how much of that high concept stuff you need to get into, but just the core concept of a ghost ground grappler, that's so nice, I'm in. The little guy kind of works. I think his arms might be a bit too stubby though. Cryogonal, hated as a Smash candidate and hated in Pokemon. Doesn't look anything like a Pokemon, but unlike something like, say, the Ultra Beast, there's no real motivation for it. It's just weird and very out of place and not particularly creative on top of that. You have to go catch one of these to complete the Sword and Shield DLC, and they have the audacity not even to spawn it in all weather types. I resented that so much. Get it out of here. Hexorus. It's not the most interesting pseudo-legendary out there. You know, it's pure dragon typing, so a bit less creative than some of them, and Tusks can really only go so far. You could definitely get attacks out of it, but it's a little bit of an awkward thing to be doing with your head. But you get the dragon archetype and sort of the rampaging bull archetype all in one. There's something to do there. I could see Outrage being used as kind of a riskier take on Roy's double edge dance, where it just goes absolutely ham, but if it misses, you're in deep trouble. Put Guillotine on there as a giant forward smash. Just an all-out hyper aggro dragon. Yeah, you know what? I'm kind of talking myself into this one. Yeah, why not? S tier. Just it, though. The pre-evolutions are too differently shaped. Ditto. See, I really don't like talking about the Pokeball Pokemon in Smash. As far as I'm concerned, it makes no difference to me. I'd be perfectly happy taking one of them out of their Pokeball and upgrading it to a playable fighter, but I'm gonna do it for Ditto. This as a Smash implementation is just perfect the way it is. I have zero interest in trying to translate any of that transformation stuff into Smash as a full-fledged character, which is a roundabout way of saying F tier. Another transforming Pokemon, Silvally. This one functions kind of like Genesect, kind of like Arceus. You give it a different memory to hold, and that changes its typing and the typing of its signature move. I just think it's less interesting than either of those though. Yeah, its signature move is reminiscent of equipping a drive to Genesect, but Genesect only had a few to choose from, so you could make a very interesting sort of custom character-ish implementation that wouldn't really work for 18 types. That's really clunky to select and way too much to account for on the character select screen. And then what, is it going toe-to-toe with Arceus? Really? It's upstaged. For what it's worth though, if you did want to take that approach, it comes with a good clone. A bit of a pointless clone. I wasn't even really 100% sure why Type Null needed to evolve in the first place, but it's something. Graplocked. This is kind of a fun design. I like the way it's implemented. It's got 8 tentacles, but it has 4 arms and 3 legs and then like a belt. Really cool distribution. Got kind of a luchador vibe going on. Obviously, as a 4-armed grappler, it's going up against Machamp though, and that's a pretty tough sell. And Grapploct is also weirdly a pure fighting type Pokemon. You could give it some water moves, but it's really not as aquatic as you'd expect. It is fun, and the 3 legs and being able to unfurl its belt would give it some moveset potential that Machamp doesn't have. The Mexican wrestler concept is fun too. They call it the Jiu-Jitsu Pokemon, but they don't do anything in the actual visual design to suggest that at all. It's clearly supposed to be a luchador. I came into this expecting to just call it upstage, but it's got enough interesting stuff going on. I'll let it slip into B. Clobbopus, though, not that interesting. You know what definitely does work for the clone route, though? Nidoking and Nidoqueen. Their body types are close enough that things would translate over pretty well. Now, Nidoking has a longer horn and a longer tail, but you know what? That works out just fine. In Pokemon, Nidoking is faster and more aggressive and more offensively oriented, so he could have better hitboxes. That's part of his thing, as well as being a bit faster and stronger in general. Nidoqueen, on the other hand, is more defensively oriented. And they're obviously both going to be heavyweights, but maybe make it so that Nidoqueen has better armor tolerance on some moves, something like that. Give her more of a poison emphasis, have some of her moves do a damage over time thing that Nidoking's don't. Maybe just change like 1 special move and 1 or 2 normal moves between them, and you've got 2 really functional characters. No, more than functional, honestly fantastic. I think you need to pair them together. I don't necessarily mean a tandem character or anything like that. I mean, they're going in S tier on the strength of them being a 2-for-1, and both individual characters would work really well. Their pre-evolutions don't really work as clones. Nidorina maybe slightly, but not really. Another Gen 1 2-for-1 here. We've got Sandslash. Yeah, it's really easy to see how this one works. You've got the long talons, and then you've obviously got the quills. That would be a huge part of the design. Kind of like Sonic, but slower and hopefully less degenerate. Picture a bit more like Craig from Rivals of Aether. He handles the rolling into a ball thing better. And then the 2-for-1 in this case is Alolan Sandslash, which obviously works pretty similarly overall, and you just throw a couple ice moves on there. Similar logic as for Nidoking and Nidoqueen. I'm feeling more of an A tier on this one though. You know, Nidoking and Nidoqueen, the ability to differentiate between them using poison and armor is so natural. I just think that lends itself to a more interesting direction than you can do with these two, and I think I would probably take the Nidos as more interesting standalone characters anyways, as in I would choose either Nido over either Sandslash. Again, maybe a bit of that poison bias coming in. Really solid though, and you could even kind of make the Sandshrews work. How successful these would be would depend on how much you utilize the Quills and the Sandslash's moveset, and actually, you know what? You probably want to use those a fair amount. Okay, I'm gonna drop those down. Alomomola, fun to say, but your very typical floppy fish. Apart from that, it's also kind of a cleric support Pokemon, which don't really work that well for Smash. Masquerain is your typical flappy wings, and then Surskrit is just bad. Archeops almost looks like flappy wings, but it's actually adapted to be better at hunting on the ground. And then its body type while it's on the ground is honestly pretty good, and it's actually a really good candidate for honoring the flying-like aspect by having it being able to glide around and maybe have multiple jumps without being able to truly fly. All that being said, a big feature of Archeops is its signature ability, Defeatist, which drops its stats when it reaches half health. That's what makes it bad in the Pokemon franchise, because it has incredible abilities apart from that, but it's just too unreliable. So to translate that into Smash, you essentially have to make a reverse Lucario situation where it's ridiculously powerful early on, but then as it takes damage, it gets less and less effective. That sounds like a really toxic, unfun play pattern to me. The character starts off broken, but then if you're losing, you just feel like you're getting beat up harder and harder. And yes, you could ignore that, but as I said, I do value being able to translate what makes the Pokemon unique directly into Smash. That's not a fun translation. There's no real other way to put it. Pair that with being an average or kind of below average pick to begin with, it's D tier. Still better than the goofy ass pre-evolution though. And then its fossil counterpart, Caracosta. This is very Blastoise, except less interesting because it doesn't have the water cannons. That does make it more physical than Blastoise, but we already have Squirtle in the game as a physical turtle Pokemon. Oh, well, what if you want a heavier Squirtle? Okay, well, Wartortle's right there. Yeah, it's upstaged. And then the pre-evolution is a turtle. That is shockingly turtley. Golisopod. This is a really cool one. Its signature ability is Emergency Exit, which automatically switches it out when it's in danger. That could be translated a couple of different ways. I could easily see that being some kind of counter or movement special move, or it could be an ingrained ability where if it's part of a Pokemon Trainer 2.0 team and its health gets past a certain threshold, it could switch out automatically. I know the show does something like this. It's got a really nice body shape with lots of room for armor focus. Not going to be doing a whole lot of kicking with those spindly little legs, but it's got those really nice clawed arms and multiple other arms on top of that to help out. That's an S tier, particularly in a team context. Just the big one though. Colossal, another big big one. It has a vaguely functional, if awkward body shape. That coal piled up is a bit much, but there's some room to shave it down. If we are taking that to be a pile of coal, I think you get rid of some of that without really taking away from the feel of the Pokemon that much. You obviously don't want to be totally distorting them to try and force them into Smash, but that seems fair to me. Beyond that, relatively straightforward as far as a lot of these rock types go, but there is one thing that stands out to me. I've talked about wanting to emphasize Pokemon's type systems in Smash more, just not in the way the original Pokemon trainer tried to do it back in Brawl. That was stupid. So Colossal could have some fire moves, and then Tar Shot, which in Pokemon slows the opponent down and makes them weaker against fire moves, could work pretty much the exact same way. So it's a speed debuff projectile, probably kind of a slow trap-based one in its own way, and then if an opponent is afflicted with it, they're vulnerable to specifically Colossal's fire moves, not just its entire kit. Again, a more selective take on Inkling's Ink mechanic. That makes it stand out to me a bit more than it would otherwise. I'll give it a B tier. It's still not crazy in my eyes. I think someone like Trevenant, for example, does it better, and also just there are so many big, bulky rock types, and there are others that just like more than Colossal. Not bad. And the pre-evolutions don't really work. Volbeat and Illumise, you would have to have them as a tandem pair. That's a kind of lame tandem pair, I'm not gonna lie. If Plusle and Minun are in C tier, they're definitely not going higher. Dreadnought, back in turtle territory. Now, to be fair, this one is more distinct from Blastoise. It's got more of a focus on biting because it's a snapping turtle and it's got that head spike. I think I gotta put it in the same tier though. Tiers still aren't ordered, but for the record, I'll put it above Caracosta for the sake of it. Choodle, weirdly enough, kind of works as an echo. Sudowoodo. The body shape is okay, and that concept of fossilized wood that's pretending to be a regular tree but is really bad at its job, it's funny in the context of Pokemon. Doesn't particularly lend itself to Smash though. Its whole thing is, I'm gonna freeze up. Oh, that didn't work, better run. It learns moves like Copycat and Mimic, which is a bit unusual, gives it a little bit of a distinguishing mechanical characteristic, but really not that much, and there are other Pokemon that I definitely think would embody that aspect more. Not that it's an especially promising one for Smash to begin with. That's like a D tier. And Bonsly's cute, but that's about it. Volcarona. It's kind of in the same camp as Dragapult, where it doesn't really seem like the body shape should work, but if you look at it in game, it actually is animated fairly upright, and it is kind of interesting. I could see Quiver Dance being used as a buff up kind of move, Fiery Dance is some kind of spinning, all-encompassing melee attack. You could put Bug Buzz on there as a projectile, could do some moves with that pointed abdomen, even if I'd prefer the actual proper stinger bugs. And then in Scarlet and Violet, I got two Paradox forms for some reason. Violet gave us the much more straightforward Iron Moth, which almost works as an Echo Fighter. It's got some unique animation work with those floating spikes instead of the traditional wings that ideally you'd emphasize a bit more, but I think for the most part you could get away with the rigging between the wings and the spikes being the same, and then maybe Iron Moth gets a couple distinct animations or a couple distinct attacks, and that's sort of the differentiating factor. Slitherwing, the Scarlet version, that doesn't work as an Echo Fighter at all, but it's actually not awful in its own right. I think the body shape is big and awkward and clunky though, and the main thing is, how many Paradox Pokemon are you really going to try and shove in here? And out of all of them, having it be one of this half a pair thing feels kind of funny to me. That's a statement that applies to both of them. I think Volcarona B tier, Slitherwing C, Iron Moth you could do something with, Larvesta maybe not. Excadrill, a bit of a fan favorite, partially due to how good it was in the competitive scene. Like a lot of Gen 5 Pokemon, it is kind of designed to usurp an earlier generation one. In this case, it's very clearly supposed to be Sandslash. You know, it's a ground type, it's got the talons. I think there's actually a bit more to it though, because Sandslash rolls into a spiked ball, which we have plenty of ball moves in Smash already. This turns into a drill. On a standalone basis, I don't think there's quite as much you could do with that, but it's definitely more standout and more interesting. And then it's also got way more potential to attack with its head. The Sandslash has got A, partially as a result of them working as a bundle. I think Excadrill works better. Part of that also comes from Drillbur working just fine as an Echo Fighter. It wouldn't be able to use the same kind of head style moves, but that could be what separates it, right? Change a couple of the headbutt attacks to something else. I guess the other thing to mention is that its main abilities are all associated with Sandstorms, a weather type in Pokemon, which as I've mentioned is rough to translate into Smash, but I think Sand is definitely the most forgiving of them. You can just kind of associate that with being ground style moves, and I think Garchomp would be the premier dig into the ground kind of Pokemon, but Excadrill honestly would be up there too. I'm really not worried about it at all. I brought up Volcarona, let's talk about Donphin, the other Pokemon that got two Paradox forms. The elephant shape is kind of funny to deal with as far as quadrupeds go. The trunk obviously offers a lot of moveset potential, but the thing is, Donphin's is actually pretty stubby. It's based more around rolling into a ball, which as I've mentioned, I would be happy to see on a slower Pokemon, but I do think there are just better candidates overall, more moveset potential. It's not that quadrupeds don't function in Smash, but I do think they need to work a little bit harder to justify themselves. And other than that rolling into a ball gimmick, what is Donphin? It's a very basic Pokemon. Tusks can can't really be used for that many attacks, they're too stubby. That's obviously where Great Tusk comes in. Even then though, picturing how it would actually make those functional weapons in Smash, it would have to really swing its entire body around pretty awkwardly. It's just such a stumpy design. And then Iron Treads is in kind of an awkward spot where I think you would actually need to change quite a bit of animation work compared to Donphin, but what are you really getting in exchange for that work? I don't really think it distinguishes itself particularly well at all. It's ground steel compared to Donphin's ground, which, okay, fair enough, and it's actually a bit funny that most of the Iron Paradox Pokemon aren't actually steel type, but does that really bring a ton to the table in terms of making the bulky elephant style design stand out? I don't really think so. I think it would have to function more or less the same, except again for all of the animation changes you need to make to account for the locomotion differences. Donphin, I guess I'll give a B tier. It works. I can see it pretty easily. It doesn't excite me though. I think both the Paradox forms are okay, and then Phanpy with the even stubbier trunk and the lack of tusks, I don't think that one works at all. Why would you pick it as an Echo Fighter when you've got two more to choose from? Copperajah, another elephant Pokemon, and this is a much more traditional elephant. Donphin is actually pretty small, it's only 3 feet tall. This is holding down that Pokemon fort of the actual real true elephant that took a surprisingly long time to be developed. And I think if whale can get a tier, then elephant can get a tier too. Just let it be huge. Too huge for Smash, but I like that role it's filling in Pokemon, just let it keep that. Rattata or Eradicate. We've already got a Pikachu tier. These may not be Pikachus, but any small rodent, particularly a small rodent that's more boring than Pikachu, is going to have a real tough time. Size isn't an issue. Canonically, Eradicate is actually twice the size of Pikachu, and I'm generally much more willing to scale up than scale down, but I'm just not interested. While we're doing some housekeeping, the Kingdra line, I know they're all seahorses and they do have wings on their back technically, but they really need to function in water. That's how they work in Pokemon. Also, just on a personal note, Seadra over Kingdra any day. They had a good thing going there. A more suitable Gen 1 Pokemon, Hypno. I say more suitable, but it is a psychic type and a sleep inducer, and both of those are obviously niches that are kind of filled in Smash already, very difficult to compete against. Sleep in particular is really difficult to make work in a fighting game to begin with. Now, you could picture it bashing people with the little pendulum it holds, so there is a playstyle there. It's not the world's most brilliant weapon, and it's not really intended to be used that way, but it is at least unique. That'll be like a C tier. Jazzy doesn't even have the pendulum yet, though. While we're on the topic of niches that are already filled in Smash, Carnivine, and this one's a bit of a shame. An angry biting flower that learns a bunch of trap style moves, that's an interesting concept for a fighter. Except that obviously this guy exists already, so yeah, that's a tough break, but you've been upstaged. Let's talk about the legendary beasts, Raikou, Suicune, and Entei. I think out of the three of these, Suicune is the strongest candidate, not only because it appears on the box of a Pokemon game, which the other two don't have, so these bundled legendaries are always tricky to deal with, but that does put Suicune out in front a little bit, although Entei did get its own movie, so I don't know, I think the games are more important. But even not taking that into account, Suicune also has the ribbons coming off it that it can manipulate, which gives it more moveset potential. It's a surprisingly defensive Pokemon, and I think its in-game moveset within the Pokemon series is also a little bit underwhelming, but you can definitely picture how it would work. It's a bulky water type, use water moves, use recovery moves, use ice moves, some psychic moves thrown in there as well. It's not like the others don't function very similarly. Being honest, they're all extremely straightforward quadrupeds. They really don't do anything that spectacular. They're definitely being carried by their legendary status, but they are really legendary. I'm gonna give Suicune the bump up into A. That'll be the textbook one. I was gonna put Entei and Raikou in B, but maybe you want to do some kind of legendary beast fusion concept, them all being used by a trainer in the same moveset kind of deal. They're not even the strongest lower candidates for that, but I guess I'll go A tier. These bundled legendaries are awkward. The ultimate awkward bundled legendaries though, the Swords of Justice. Out of the core 3 Musketeers gang, I think Terrakion is definitely the standout in terms of a body type that would work well for Smash. Again, you're coming into that kind of charging bull concept. I know that Cobalion is supposed to be the leader, but it's a tall, gangly quadruped. That's an awkward body type, and really the same applies to Virizion. I think even Virizion with the grass powers, though, make it stand out a little bit more. Steel fighting, which Cobalion is, can work for Smash. It can even work quite well for Smash, but it is really based off your existing body type. Those horns look a bit awkward to fight with. The entire thing is kind of clunky, though, and I'm just bypassing all of it because if you want to use any of these, I think Keldeo is definitely the standout. Not only is it by far the most separable from the rest of the Swords of Justice, it's the new upcoming hero in lore, whereas the other 3 are kind of already an established group. But I also think its body type works by far the best. That long serrated horn is actually pretty well positioned. You could make a decent moveset out of that that wouldn't feel too awkward to fling around. I think you just start the game in the Resolute form. There's no need to start off with a little baby basic version. You know, if Corrin's getting the fully fledged Yato right from the start of their appearance, I don't think you need some kind of upgrade mechanic built in there. I think clearly what you would do here is have Keldeo be the standalone fighter and then have the other Swords of Justice Justice appear in the final Smash. That just makes so much sense. And Keldeo is actually a really cool concept for a quadruped. That's going to get S tier. I'll put the others up alongside Keldeo with the understanding that they're showing up in the final Smash, not as standalone fighters. And then both these sets of legendaries got associated Paradox forms, except for Keldeo, funny enough. But starting with the Swords of Justice, these ones are really easy to translate over, at least in terms of body shape, because they're basically the same Pokemon. Like, so similar that it's actually a bit hard to justify. Iron Crown, yeah, maybe slow it down and throw on a couple longer range psychic moves. Iron Leaves, same thing. Iron Boulder, same thing. That one's identity feels a little more muddled though. Once again, I wouldn't really advocate for the Swords of Justice to be their own standalone fighters, but if you did, they do come with their own Echo Fighters basically bundled in ready to go, so that's something. That does not apply to the legendary beasts. They got their own prehistoric dragon versions, which have been, I would say, the more controversial designs for sure, but you have to give the Pokemon Company credit for at least trying something decidedly different. Walking Wake, the Suicune variant, once again stands out the most to me. Not only because it continued to get preferential treatment, it was introduced to the game first and then the others came later as DLC, but also because its body shape I think is just quite compatible with Smash. The doubled up tentacle tail thing is an interesting twist on the ribbons and you could use it in a similar fashion. Proportions overall work pretty well. My biggest problem with it is that its signature move, Hydro Steam, relies on harsh sunlight, which again is just not really a mechanic I want brought into Smash, but honestly it's really not that big a deal, and I think it was mainly just done to allow for a prehistoric Paradox Pokemon to be a water type. They all have the photosynthesis ability which activates in harsh sunlight, and usually harsh sunlight suppresses water moves, so if you want to make a water ancient Paradox Pokemon, you need to combat that. I think it's pretty functional on its own. Gouging Fire, the Entei Paradox Pokemon, definitely the most comparable to its base form. The main difference is that giant sail on its head, which is really big and clunky. It opens up some new attack possibilities, which is cool, although pretty awkward ones, and you either make it not a hurt box, which would feel strange, or it's this really giant, uncomfortable hurt box, which would also not be ideal. Its signature move is just Protect that burns the opponent. There's something to do with a counter there, it's not that interesting. And then we have Raging Bolt, which I know has been by far the most controversial of any of these. I started off a hater, it's grown on me a little bit more over time. I actually think turning Raiku's cape into that thundercloud looking thing that can actually unfurl is kind of a clever touch, but it's kind of a moot point because the draft body type really just doesn't work. These ones I'm going to have to evaluate separately. Walking Wake I'll give an A tier. This one actually works pretty well. Gouging Fire is by far the one you could make the biggest clone argument for. That's Sail though. Yeah, nah, it's too much. It kills it for me. And then Raging Bolt is just a non-starter. Trying to even use this thing in Pokemon without manually adjusting the camera is just so awkward. Farigiraf is in the same camp. Now, its body shape is marginally less awkward. It doesn't have the giant thundercloud cape tail thing you need to account for, but however you want to scale it, it's some combination of too tall or too skinny. Now, Girafarig gets pre-evolution, and for a long time the only one in that line. It actually works much better, funny enough. You could have kind of a cool tandem psychic thing going on there. Think marginally like Cat Dog from the original Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl, although obviously toned down quite a bit. Girafarig is not Pikachu though, right? Generally speaking, you absolutely go for the highest evolution, and then even if you're going for a Pokemon Trainer-esque thing, this is only a 2-stage evolution, so that makes things awkward too. It's not like it's a brilliant starting point to begin with. Yeah, I'm gonna put it in the same tier. This is another ride-on situation where having an evolution actually hurts it. Speaking of painful evolutions, Probopass. Ew. I mean, yeah, Nosepass isn't a good candidate, but it's at least some vague semblance of cute in its own weird, blocky way. Probopass is just straight up uncomfortable. Stonejourner is kind of in the same camp. As far as these statue sculpture-themed Pokemon go, it's actually marginally better than some. You could make like a borderline D case here, but it barely has any joints, and this is not Steve. Remoraid is your typical floppy fish. Octillery that it evolves into for some reason is not. Yeah, I'm just gonna put it in floppy fish tier too. I know it can technically walk around outside the water, but it needs water. Tentacruel is one of my favorite Pokemon of all time, but yeah, they're in the same boat. Their regional variant, or I guess it's supposed to be more like a convergent evolution concept in Gen 9. Toadscruel. This one is land-based, so we can't handwave this one away. It needs to be judged on its own merits more, which I'm gonna say are not fantastic. Its body shape is vaguely functional. You know, you could picture it bundling a couple of its limbs together to be thrown up for attacks. You could see it coiling up and then launching its head forward, but it's still a long way from feeling natural. It doesn't really do all that much in game to make it stand out. Honestly, even in Pokemon, watching it scuttle around on the land feels kind of strange and unnecessary. I'm gonna put it in D tier. If you were absolutely desperate to make it work, you probably could, and if you wanted to do like a Gen 9 Pokemon trainer, some of those convergent evolutions probably would show up, but I just have to ask, Why Toedscruel? Then Toedscool, less legs, less echo fighting. Cerulege. Okay, so Ultra Necrozma looks less like a Pokemon and more like an edgy Yu-Gi-Oh card I would have drawn when I was 10, and I hate it. Cerulege looks less like a Pokemon and more like an edgy Yu-Gi-Oh card I would have drawn when I was 10. And oh my god, it's so cool. I think at this point I can comfortably say I'm never outgrowing the double swords as hands thing, especially on a ghost fire type, which yes, admittedly does already have some overlap in Pokemon, even among the starters, but it just fits so well and I'm totally comfortable putting up with more, oh, another sword fighter in Smash comments over it. And then you add on its signature move being Bitter Blade, another life drain style move, one of my favorite tropes that I want to see more of in Smash, yeah. And then Armarouge, its counterpoint, fire psychic type. This one is actually surprisingly solid. The core concept behind it is that it turns its shoulder pads into a cannon, which is a really nice bit of attention to detail, but it's got more potential than that because those shoulder pads are being controlled by psychic powers, which means you could actually make them the basis for a lot of its moveset. So it's got a lot more going for it than just being another long-range shooting character. Yeah, if you couldn't tell, Cerulege is going in S tier, and you know what? Armarouge I'm gonna put up there too. It works even at a base level, and there's a lot of interesting stuff I can think of doing with those shoulder pads. And then Charcadet, the base version that can evolve into either of them. It doesn't really work as an Echo Fighter in either case, and while you could maybe have some kind of branching evolution mechanic where it starts out as Charcadet, I just think something like Cubfu works so much better for that. Yeah, I'm gonna put it in just use the evolution. It is kind of an interesting depiction of Scarlet and Violet's branching evolutions because depending which version of the game you have, that dictates which this evolves into, but I don't think you need to try and shoehorn every branching Pokemon together. Okay, and while we're talking about Scarlet and Violet, we've got Miraidon and Corridon. In the context of Scarlet and Violet, I love these Pokemon. They may honestly be my favorite box legendaries ever. It's gotta be up there, but just because they fit so well into the world of those games doesn't necessarily mean they fit so well into Smash. They're mounts, right? And you could say, well, you can take a Pokemon trainer and stick it onto one of their backs, and that would be a good way to get a Pokemon trainer actually into the action as a character. I think that may just be too bulky and awkward, though Calyrex was really pushing it, but I allowed it because, you know, it would be interesting to have something like that in the game. These guys are substantially more uncomfortable in that sense. The Pokemon trainer punching up above their head wouldn't really feel right compared to using Calyrex for attacking, and they're also just much taller characters. Okay, well, what if we throw out the whole riding mechanic and instead just have them fight on their own, usually on their own two legs, or two hover pods, I guess, half the time, and then sometimes going into the bike form for certain special moves or running or whatever. In that case, they're functional, but they lose so much of their essence when you do that. They were designed to be ridden. That's the whole premise behind them. They summon harsh sunlight or electric terrain when they're switched in. I've talked about weather before. Electric terrain is more compatible, but even in that case, I think something like Iron Hands, where you can put the electric terrain into an actual context for it, just makes more sense. There are just all these little things stacking up. They're awesome Pokemon, and I can see a case being made for them, but I gotta chop the path off of B tier. Yes, you can make them work, but by making them work, they just become so much less interesting than themselves in the Pokemon games, and so many other candidates on here. And then Cyclizar, the modern equivalent, which I guess makes it the last Pokemon on this list to have two Paradox forms, it's gonna get like a C tier. Yes, your avatar doesn't ride these in the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet games, but contextually in the world, they are the same thing. They're ride Pokemon, so they have all the same issues as Corridon and Miraidon, and it's also less interesting, and it's also not a box legendary. Dragalge, I'm gonna call Floppy Fish. Yes, I'm aware it's not technically a water type Pokemon, it's dragon poison, but its pre-evolution is, and Dragalge is still aquatic. It's meant to be mimicking kelp, and it clearly belongs in the water. It's one of the more borderline cases on here, but yeah. I'm gonna put Clawitzer, its counterpart, in the same tier. This isn't totally consistent with the other crabs and lobsters and crawfish Pokemon. Technically, it could walk around on land, but try picturing it using that claw not in the water. Borderline comedy tier, honestly, but I don't think it's quite there. Okay, I've just gathered up a whole bunch of these like flitty, fairy-ish mythicals and legendaries, even though none of them are actually fairy type at all, funny enough. I find myself feeling about the same with all of these. Yes, they all have, you know, relatively well-defined powers, and they're important story characters in different contexts and all that kind of stuff, but they just seem like they should have the ability to be flying around, and they're all really small, and I don't think any of them are especially well-suited from a body shape perspective. A lot of their more mystical and ethereal powers either don't really fit in the context of Smash or are shared with Pokemon that just work better than them. You know what? I know this is a little bit weird. I'm just gonna blanket put them all in upstaged. Yes, there's a bit more nuance to it than that. These three are a trio, these are clones, but it's fine. And hey, if Game Freak wants to get less obnoxious about making the mythicals catchable, then maybe I'll get less obnoxious with my tier list placements. You know a mythical I like a lot better though? Zeraora. In the games, I'd honestly say it's nothing super exceptional, but in the show, it's this kind of Mewtwo-esque levitation cat cat revenge against humanity type thing, except it's also this blazing fast electric type with flying sparks everywhere. Its signature move is Plasma Fist, which makes normal type moves electric type moves for the rest of the turn. That doesn't really translate into Smash directly very well, but it would make for a really cool projectile, maybe even a down smash if you wanted to interpret it differently, or both. It's got that tails slash cape hybrid thing I could use for a lot of attacks. Body shape works fantastic even outside of that. It's a really cool Pokemon that they wanted to push. You know, it plays a relatively prominent role in the show. You get why it showed up in Pokemon Unite. At the same time, it's a very tropey Pokemon. Not that those tropes are bad, but it's the fast, vengeful cat thing, so it's definitely overlapping with Mewtwo, and then honestly, it's kind of doing a similar thing to Lucario as well. And it's a fast electric type, which is a niche that's definitely taken already. Not quite in the same way though. I'm gonna say A tier. Clefable. As a Gen 1 pink cutesy fairy type, it definitely overlaps a lot with the Jigglypuff line in Smash, but a big part of that Pokemon's identity is the balloon aspect, which is absent here. You could have it emphasize the fairy and moon themes a lot more with stuff like Moonblast. It would be a good candidate for Moonlight as a self-healing kind of move. Body shape is not that good. It's pretty stumpy. It does have the wings and tail, so it's got a bit of a boost over these similar stumpy biped designs. Not fantastic though. It's another one of these cleric type Pokemon, a lot of support and disruption and healing type moves. There's a lot of stuff that I'm not really feeling on. It's just too basic, D tier. And the other even more basic ones definitely aren't faring better. Beware. It's a normal fighting bear type. Those all make it perfectly good candidates. It's just very basic, too basic. Even in Smash, where you can already get it out of a Pokeball, it's just like, really? This is one of the ones you went with? Okay. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not interesting. And no Echo Fighter potential for Stuffle. Whimsicott. This is another very notorious support Pokemon. It does have some potential for cotton-based moves. That's a unique angle, but most of what that translates to is just kind of puffing up, which is obviously Jigglypuff's domain. Even if this would be used more offensively, it would be a very floaty Pokemon, again, in line with Jigglypuff. Grass is competitive, Fairy is competitive, body type really doesn't work outside of the cotton thing, not bringing too much else to the table. It's an inoffensive C tier. Not much of an Echo Fighter either. Floatzel. I think in another world this could be a lot of fun. A zippy water type Pokemon that uses its tail for a lot of attacks. That's putting it in pretty heavy competition with Squirtle though. Obviously not totally overlapping, you know, the lack of a shell and the addition of that float thing. Big differentiators. His body type is a bit different. I think its body type standalone, as in outside of a specialized role in a trio, actually works for Smash a bit better. B tier? I think Weasel works okay as an Echo Fighter. Technically, it actually works pretty well. The differently shaped flotation ring, I don't think that actually impacts too much. You wouldn't be using that for a lot of attacks. It's just not really bringing much to the table, especially because Floatzel's already small and quick. Shiftry. This is interesting. Watching it waddle around on those stilts would be a lot of fun, and it could actually use them for some pretty nice extended kicking attacks. It's got the long leaf arms that could be used for slaps or bladed slashes. It's based on a Tengu, Japanese spirits that play tricks on people, so it makes sense that it's a dark type and learns a lot of disruption style moves. Could be a nice candidate for Fake Out as an invincible move, so sort of a proactive counter, which makes sense considering that Fake Out prevents the opponent from attacking. Torment in Pokemon prevents the opponent from using the same move twice in a row. You could maybe get away with that in Smash. It's a bit of a weird debuff. It feels more like a multiverses thing, honestly, and might be too annoying and obnoxious to keep track of, but it's kind of an option. I'm just throwing stuff out here, you know what I mean? I'm going A tier. I like the Trickster angle, and even if you wanted to downplay that a bit, it's still just a very functional grass type, right? It's got a good body shape that's very distinct from what we already have. It's not the most earth-shattering Pokemon you could add to Smash, but it's cool and it works well. I don't think we need two of it though. Furfrou. Now, this one would have some kick-ass alternate skins, I'll give you that, but other than that, it's just a dog. It's getting D tier. For dog, that actually applies to more here. Mightyena, cool design, but it's a dog. Poochyena works okay as an Echo Fighter, but largely because there's just very little to this. Mabostiff, another dark dog. Oh, he's such a good boy, though. This one's also definitely more of a modern standout. It plays a relatively substantial role in Gen 9's story. Definitely has a lot more personality to it than Mightyena. Okay, I'll give that one a huge bump up to B tier. It also helps that its body type is not necessarily better than Mightyena's, but definitely more interesting. More of a barrel through you kind of thing. And then Maschiff would be a really fun Echo Fighter. Needs a different idle stance with that worried look on its face, obviously, but its actual attacks could function more or less the same. And Mabostiff is a very big dog, which would make having a small, agile puppy version of it actually work quite well. Cacturn. This is kind of cool. A cactus scarecrow Pokemon would be a great candidate for moves like Spiky Shield. I feel like if you're going for a spiky grass Pokemon though, Chestnut's right there. Not much potential for Catnia either. Crocodile is also caught in a bit of an awkward spot because I like Crocodile. It's a fun design. Love the name as well. It all comes together perfectly. But if you want a chomping croc type Pokemon, Feraligator's pretty tough competition. If you're wanting a Pokemon that emphasizes ground type stuff like Sandstorm or Digging, you know, you're going up against Garchomp, you're going up against Excadrill. Yeah, it's just not quite cutting it. I'd almost like to give this one a bias bump up, but I can't justify it. Crocodile MockRock is a pretty solid Echo Fighter at least. Sandile is a quadruped. Zangoose. Zangoose by itself is okay. The only thing that really makes it stand out though is its association with Seviper. Now in Pokemon lore, these are mortal enemies, but picture a world where, say, Zangoose is using Seviper as a whip. That'd be fun. Is it very Smash-like? No. It's the kind of thing I could vaguely see maybe sneaking into Pokken, for example, but it's a bit of a stretch. More of a stretch than I'm willing to make. Zangoose without Seviper is functional but bland. Too bland, in fact, loses too much of its personality, is getting dropped down to C. Seviper is an F. If we're going to be doing design exercises with a snake, definitely pick Arbok. Snorlax I'm kind of split on because it's such an iconic Pokemon, right? And on a surface level, it's so obvious as a big, slow heavyweight. Is it really offering much besides being a big, slow heavyweight, though? It doesn't really do all that much besides sleep, which isn't particularly translatable to Smash, and it's going up against Pokemon like Hariyama, which fill a very similar role in a way that I'd say is much more interesting and well-defined. Even if you just wanted to make it another part of a trio so it didn't need to be so fully fleshed out, I wouldn't really advocate for Gen 1 again. I'll go B tier to avoid a riot, but I'm sorry, I like Snorlax as a Pokemon. Everyone likes Snorlax, but it's not that interesting. Munchlax could be a fantastic semi-clone, though. You need to change a fair amount on it, maybe a bit too much, but if you could make it work, the juxtaposition would be fantastic. Kommo-o, Gen 7 pseudo-legendary. Its abilities are all protection against very specific types of moves, which obviously isn't directly translatable, but it does very clearly imply that sort of armor-based playstyle. I mean, just look at it, of course it does. Clanging Scales, its signature move goes through Substitute, so I like the idea of maybe doing residual damage even behind a shield. Not necessarily fully unblockable, but you know, taking chip damage from it. It's a fighting dragon and it's got a sound theme to it and an armor theme to it. That's a lot of stuff. Body type is fantastic. It's got the mace on its tail, long limbs, armored head. Hell yeah, that's an S tier. And Hakamo-o could be packaged with it pretty well. It's got a fairly different looking body, but all of the elements are intact. You know, you've got the tail club, but smaller and less powerful. That's fine. Jangmo-o, we're good. Wormadam. Oh my god, just end its suffering already. What happened here? I cannot in good conscience condone these existing. Burmy, its pre-evolution is at least less offensive to look at, but I just need to pluck them out by the roots here. And then Motham, the one that male Burmies get to evolve into. That one's way more straightforward. It's just another moth, another flappy wings. But why do we need another one of these? Especially another one attached to that. Deoxys. This is a fun one. You always have to give some amount of consideration to form shifting Pokemon. Here though, I think it works really well. It's got normal form, attack form, defense form, and speed form, and there are a few ways I can think to interpret this, right? Always starting out in the normal form, and then either it just changes into different forms for different moves. So for say all of its smash attacks, it changes into attack form, then back into normal form when they're over. If you gave it some kind of counter or armor move, it would go into defense form. Burst movement options would be speed form, that kind of thing. Or you could do kind of a hybrid between the extreme changes of say a Sheik and Zelda or a Pokemon trainer and the more subtle changes of Shulk's Monadowars, where it's allowed to change its stance with down special. Its stance in this case referring to the form it changes to, and then obviously it changes its physical traits. It's really fast and light in speed form, it's really slow and heavy in defense form, you know the drill. But also hopefully it changes the actual properties of its moves. Maybe it at least gets different special moves depending on which form it's in, and then its normals and its aerials can have wildly different attack strengths and stuff like that. It's a well-known legendary. All of its forms have fantastic body shapes for a fighting game. Easy S tier. Metagross. This is interesting for a quadruped. I think the profile is actually okay. Steel Psychic's interesting typing, maybe give it Meteor Mash for a forward smash. Zen Headbutt could be its side special burst option because hey, its whole body's its head. It's a really great fit for moves like Metal Claw, Hammer Arm. This is a Pokemon where you could maybe vaguely consider using the Mega Evolution. I think that's a bit much, and then it's just a four-armed Pokemon except it's hovering, so it's kind of a more awkward version of Machamp, but it would make for a really fun final smash animation because the whole concept behind Metagross is it's essentially just more and more Beldums being fused together. So for the startup of its final smash, you could have Beldums actually come in from off screen and fuse onto it. That would be cool. I think I'm going to say a very solid B tier. It's not the best fit in the world, but it's at least doing something kind of unique. If it's a whole bunch of Beldums though, I don't think we need less Beldums. Another interesting psychic typing, Metacham, fighting psychic in this case. It's not really bringing a whole lot to the table that other Pokemon don't necessarily do better though. If you did want to use it, this is one where I think it actually would make sense to bring the Mega Evolution in, then at least it can be using its psychic powers to control those ribbons to put some more work in. Even though it's a little bit weird that this one was chosen to get a Mega Evolution, it's not a very significant Pokemon. It's not really doing all that much. It fits, but doesn't need to fit. I'll give it a C tier. I guess I'll give the original a C tier as well. You know, the combination of psychic attacks and martial arts attacks is kind of an interesting juxtaposition, but that's almost the necessity of psychic characters in Smash to begin with. Mewtwo may be a pure psychic type, but it's still doing plenty of physical attacks. It has to. Meta type, the pre-evolution, it works okay as an Echo Fighter, specifically for base form Medicham. If you're going with the Mega Evolution, then obviously it's a non-starter. You know what, I think I am actually underselling the Mega Evolution a little bit. I'll give it B. It doesn't help that I just don't really like this Pokemon very much, and if we're gonna go with this four-limbed fighting type thing, then, you know, I'd rather see Machamp, but you could do something with it. Magcargo, that's a no. Slugma, also a no. Hold the comments, please. Speaking of holding the comments, Lopunny. Yeah, I'm not dealing with this one. No, you know what, we can go lower. Congratulations, Internet, this is what you get. Thievul. This old-timey bank robber aesthetic is a fantastic thing to give to a fox. It fits so well, but at the end of the day, it's kind of got the Mightyena thing going on where it's just kind of a dark animal. I'll give it a C, because again, it does definitely have more personality than Mightyena. I didn't even intend to crap on those things so much. I do like Mightyena as a Pokemon, but it's a dog. And then Nickit would be a solid clone, if nothing spectacular. They're not helped by the fact that if we wanted to take the fox route, I would way rather go with Ninetales. It's not even a competition. There's a lot of moveset potential by manipulating those tails, and it's easy to picture an extremely elegant, flowing moveset with a lot of fire type attacks in there. Lighting the tails on fire, shooting out blasts of fire. And then if you want to say, well, fire's too stiff competition, you've got Alolan Ninetales, which seems to have definitely cemented itself as one of the fan-favorite regional variant Pokemon at this point. You do, of course, need to take Delphox into account here as well, which I would definitely say works better than either of these. I think base form Ninetales should be a B tier, but it's also one of my favorite Pokemon. Very Gen 1er opinion, so it's getting the bump up to A. I don't know why I said Gen 1er, I started out in Gen 3. And then Alolan Ninetales would obviously be a fantastic Echo Fighter, but I'm going to put it in A tier alongside the original. Think of all the niches it fills, right? If you wanted to do a Pokemon trainer that covers regional variants, if you want an Ice type, if you want a Fairy type, it can hold down the fort in a lot of ways the original can't. As for the Vulpixes, they're okay. Alright, back to Gen 1er talk, Alakazam. It's a fast glass cannon psychic type, so again, we're very much back in Mewtwo territory. The one thing that it is really bringing to the table is the spoons, so it's kind of a dual-wielding sword fighter. A very stubby sword fighter though, and Mewtwo is, for all intents and purposes, kind of a sword fighter in Smash anyways. Less so in Ultimate, where they added a massive hurt box to the tail, but we don't need to talk about that. Mega Alakazam is actually kind of interesting though. Now it's got more spoons and it's wielding them entirely with its mind. As I've demonstrated, I like that concept of manipulating stuff with your mind for psychic types. It makes them fit more naturally into Smash, which is inherently a very physical game. So a more spoon-based moveset where it's hovering just slightly off the ground in that cross-legged stance, you know, I could kind of see it. I'm pretty comfortable calling basic Alakazam completely upstaged. Mega Alakazam B tier maybe? Kadabra, the one spoon versus two spoons thing is kind of interesting compared to Alakazam, but I think you probably need to change just a bit too much, and Alakazam, again, is just not a huge contender to begin with. And then Abra's not doing much of anything. That even applies to Pokemon, it just tries to run away. Stunfisk. Okay, I don't understand what's happening here, and I definitely don't understand why it's happening twice. I don't hate this thing, though. I mean, I do hate them for Smash, but it's a good joke. Exploud, a very sound-based Pokemon. This is one of those victims of circumstance where it's kind of cool on its own merits, and I do like it, but in a world where Toxtricity exists and Kommo exists, I mean, yeah, I'm sorry. The progression from Whismur to Loudred to Exploud is really nice. They don't work as Echo Fighters, though, and I don't want them in Smash on their own merits. Delcatty. You know, if I'm crapping on Mightyena for being just a dog, I think it's fair to do the same for just a cat. I think I actually like Skitty more, too. Granbull. Again, kind of just a dog. This one has more to it, though. It's bipedal. That's just a naturally better fit, and it's got those giant tusks. We're back in territory where having pointy things attached to your head limits you a little bit with how much you can use them, but you could definitely squeeze a couple interesting attacks out of that. It's pure fairy typing, which, if I'm being honest, I don't really understand, but it does at least give it a bit of a niche. I'm debating between B and C tier, but I don't really feel like putting Granbull in the same tier as Gen 9's box Legendaries. Yeah, C it is. Snubbull doesn't even have the tusks. Meowstic. I mean, we're back in cat territory here, but at least they're psychic cats, so they do stand out a bit. Oh, well, that's unfortunate. And then, even in a world without Mewtwo, no big bushy tail means no clone. Lightpard, another cat, and this time it's pure dark. This really is just feline Mightyena here. And then Purloin is a bit of a bizarre starter. Alright, Snom. I know nothing about Snom, but I know at some point, some people online found it funny. I don't know the context. I have no idea what the joke was, but I'm told that at some point there was indeed a joke. As for its evolution, Frostmoth, classic flappy wings. The Gen 6 legendaries, Xerneas and Yveltal. These are representations of the push and pull between life and death, which is maybe a bit high concept for Smash, and they're not particularly brilliant fits body shape wise, particularly Yveltal. Xerneas is the hippie that creates life energy and calms Yveltal down. It's the more fitting one, but still feels weird to pluck out on its own. And then how do you make that dynamic work in a Smash game? Xerneas and Yveltal I'm just writing off. Again, these are very high concept Pokemon. I think designating them as stage hazards or Pokeballs like the Smash team decided to actually do was the right play here. Electros. In some arts, this almost looks like it could not be a floppy fish. It is technically just pure electric type. And yet, Rotom. This is another transforming Pokemon, not technically directly transforming. In this case, the concept is a ghost possessing different household appliances. But in the context of Smash, I think you could easily just have it poof between different forms for different moves, no problem. No Zelda or Shulk type form switching here. I think this is a very clear case of just different moves use different forms. Use the Fridge form for a stall and fall down air, zoom along the ground in the mower form, you get the idea. My main hesitation here, even though a lot of the possession forms are actually quite serviceable, and even though Rotom is very important in the world of Pokemon, you know, it's a Pokedex for God's sake. It really does power a lot of stuff. The base form Rotom is an awful fit for Smash. Way too small, no limbs to work with, hovers off the ground. So I think if you were going to put this into Smash, you would basically have only its idle stance be the base form Rotom. And even then you would probably need to size it up and have it low to the ground. And then for everything else, if it's dashing, if it's throwing out an attack, whatever it's doing, it always needs to transform, because I really don't want this just tiny little thing flitting around everywhere. It would be incredibly annoying. I'm going to give it a B tier because that's a lot of hoops to jump through, and all that hurtbox shifting is potentially going to get pretty annoying if we're being honest, but it's a cool concept, and again, Rotom's a pretty important Pokemon. Torkoal. I like Torkoal. I've always liked Torkoal, even though it is just a tortoise and really feels like it's missing an evolution. Smash is no place for tortoises though, as proven by Bowser falling off more and more in Ultimate. Speaking of Bowser though, Turtonator. Yeah, that's Bowser. Actually kind of like Turtonator, but yeah, it's Bowser. Lilligant. I think base form Lilligant is fine. It could be used as kind of a grass moves showcase Pokemon and would have a lot of elegant animation work on it, but I think you have to go Hisuian Lilligant here, right? It's so easy to picture a ballet-inspired moveset that'd actually be really cool, and it was one of the noble Pokemon in Pokemon Legends Arceus, which means it got its own boss fight, and you could just pluck some attacks directly out of that. I think based purely on the Pokemon qualities it has, is more of an A tier. It doesn't really do a whole lot of unique moves, and grass types competitive, fighting types competitive. It's also not necessarily the single most memorable boss fight from Pokemon Legends Arceus, but it is a boss fight, and that plus having a ballet-inspired moveset, those are really strong hooks, so it gets the bump up. Base form Lilligant is okay standalone, but I don't think it's necessary, and the little one can join it. Sigilith is flappy wings, just kind of a flying thing. Forretress is not a flying thing, but it is a floating thing, along with Glamora, although in this case there's almost something to it. It can manipulate its shape a decent amount, and having it hover very, very low to the ground wouldn't look too out of place. Its ability has it shedding toxic spikes every time it's hit, so having some kind of mechanic in Smash where either when it's hit or through some other trigger it leaves like a poison trail on the ground that you can step in. I've rejected that concept for other Pokemon, but I don't inherently hate it, and it really does fit here. Just a bit of passive ground control in a way that's not super disruptive but gives you a bit of an edge. I'll let it just vaguely sneak into D tier. It's at least kind of interesting. Glimmet, definitely not compatible. Now, if you wanted to take it in the direction of its body being used as like an arm or a whip or a mace or something like that, you could maybe even make an argument it worked better, but that seems super clumsy, and it means the only real thing you're trying to target on it is its head, which is super small. It's not happening. Bellossom. I think if we're going to have a grass dancer Pokemon, then Ballet with long limbs just blows Hula out of the water in terms of Smash compatibility. And then even if you really do love the Hula concept, Oricorio is right there. As for Vileplume, the other half of that evolution line, it's not a dancer, it's just kind of bad. It's not actually a mushroom Pokemon, but it really looks like it could be. Shares very similar problems, super stubby limbs. It's grass poison going up against Ivysaur, it's a bloom going up against Ivysaur. I've got no hesitation calling Bellossom upstaged. Vileplume is a bit more nuanced, it's more just a bad Pokemon, and it's competing against a lot of stuff, not just Ivysaur specifically, but for the sake of keeping them together from the same evolution line, it's alright. Oddish and Gloom are getting left behind, even though I like Oddish way more than anything else in that line. I talked about Glamora having toxic spikes speeding out of it. Arboliva actually gets the same thing, except it's grassy terrain this time. Not the first Sylvanos comparison I've had to make here, although if you wanted to take it more faithfully to the Pokemon games and say it only gets grass when it's hit, that is a difference. I don't really know how well you would make that work as a Smash mechanic necessarily though. What happens when you get knocked away? Do you spawn grass grass behind that your opponent just gets to stand in and heal as you're trying to get back to stage. So probably do more of a Sylvanos kind of thing, which obviously puts it in contention with Rillaboom. And I think if you take both these Pokemon and put them in Smash and have them passively spawning grass behind them wherever they walk, it's also just naturally more faithful to Rillaboom's ability. It's got long arms, that's great, but barely any legs to speak of. It could fire olives at people, but so many grass Pokemon could fire seeds, not really much of a distinction. I'm feeling like a C bordering D, might be a bit higher if Rillaboom didn't exist. And then its pre-evolutions, they're cute, but they're also wildly different shapes. And while we're taking shots at grass Pokemon, Sunflora. It should be inoffensive, but it's so inoffensive that it actually offends me. It's such a lazy design. I know we're still in Gen 2 and there's a lot of relatively simple designs running around, but this is the kind of thing a 5-year-old could come up with. See, Sunkern is actually way more inventive. Also not in its corner, Bellsprout already existed. This just seemed like an attempt to make a cuter Bellsprout, because yes, admittedly, okay, Bellsprout is kind of creepy looking, but that also makes it way more memorable. Is it a good Smash candidate? No. All of the fundamental elements are in place. It's got arms, it's got legs, it's got a head that it could attack with, but they're all just barely in place, and its overall body is way too skinny. It's grass poison again, an incredibly competitive category. It's an F tier. And then its evolutions, funny enough, I think are right down there with it. They're all wildly different body shapes, but I don't feel like having any of them plot along in Smash. And again, they're victims of the carnivorous trapping flower thing. I don't think it's as big a shame as when it comes to Carnivine, but definitely shades of that. Delibird. There's not really much that makes Delibird stand out other than the sack it carries around, which is actually its tail. It pulls presents out of there, which even in Pokemon has random effects, so you could have kind of a Faust from Guilty Gear thing going on, where he just pulls out a bunch of random stuff and you're never quite sure what you're gonna get. Some of them are super harmful, some of them are maybe even helpful for your opponent. Other than that, it's a stubby ice bird with a long tail. Not too much that makes it stand out, although doing attacks with that tail that it's still holding on to could be an interesting animation direction at least. Speaking of interesting animations though, its Paradox form, Iron Bundle, has a bunch of those, which I actually think give it more moveset potential. I think it's way easier for it to use that bundle and the cord as actual attacks. It could extend its head out attack with that, get rid of some of the stubbiness problem, and it doesn't really lose anything from the original Delibird either. It can still absolutely keep that random quality to it. It's more modern, more interesting. I'm gonna give Iron Bundle an A tier, and I think it actually completely surpasses the original here. Shinotica. There's a lot of bug-type Pokemon that can struggle on this list. Lokix is not one of them. I actually really like this. It's a bug dark, which makes it stand out from a lot of them. It's got long limbs, so it's a pretty good natural fighter. And then it's got those 2 supplementary legs that it can unfold as needed. There's so much moveset potential there. You could use them to prop it up while it attacks with its other limbs. You could use it for jumping. It's a grasshopper Pokemon, so I'd expect it to have a really high jump. They're spiked, so you could maybe cling onto walls with them. Kick-focused Pokemon are nothing new here, but kicks while you're propped up in place by your other legs? That is actually a really interesting angle. Yeah, what the hell? S tier, carried entirely by body mechanics. It's so good. Nimble, not super compatible. Palafin, another Gen 9 I really like. The mechanics behind this one are tricky though. In a lot of ways, it's obvious how it works. It's a dolphin-based Pokemon, but it's a biped, so it can stand on land without a problem, and it's based on a superhero, which is really fun. It's got moves like Jet Punch, Flip Turn, Dive, being this nimble but still strong Guardian of Justice type, which is maybe a bit slow to walk around, but has great burst movement options that surround it with water. That is all really logical and would work well. The problem is translating its signature mechanic, because the way the Palafin actually works is it starts out in the dolphin form, and then once it retreats in dolphin form and comes back out, that's when it transforms, which in Pokemon is one of, if not my favorite gimmicks ever. It's Clark Kent running away and coming back. How do you translate that into Smash? I've been sitting here thinking about it. The closest I can come up with is as a transformation sequence during the intro animation, which would be a fantastic intro animation, but it's missing something. Like, the Pokemon loses some of its character like that. But any other way where you start the fight out as this dolphin just flopping around on the ground and then transform later, there's no way to make that feel like it's not shoehorned in as far as I'm concerned. But after it does transform, there's so much character and so much moveset potential. I'm going A tier. I want to go S. I really do, but I can't justify it. If you take away its gimmick, which I think you have to do, it's not nearly as distinctive. It still is pretty distinctive, that's why it's up here, but I wish it could be more. Finizen, on the other hand, is easy. That's basically just the useless half. Dialga and Palkia, the Gen 4 legendaries. The themes on these are space and time. I think there's ways to make them both work. Let's start with Palkia, who controls space. I also think it's just the more natural body shape. Not that Dialga's is too bad either. You don't need to necessarily get too trippy with the space controlling aspects. I would like to see it emphasized more than on any other character character though. Obviously Palkia should be able to teleport, but also maybe able to teleport the opponent with certain attacks. His signature move is Spatial Rend, and you could have that show up in a few different places. Maybe in one instance it teleports your opponent to you so you can grab them. In another instance it teleports your opponent a fixed distance away and then starts the knockback from the attack. That kind of thing. Could have some really big, powerful tail attacks in there too. It's also got a water aspect to it. Not the most interesting thing going on there, and I don't think you need to showcase it too much, but there is some moves that potential to pull from. Dialga is definitely the less comfortable body shape of the two. As far as quadrupeds with long necks go, it's not awful. Its neck is long, but it's not so long it becomes uncomfortable. If anything, that back frill or fan or sail or whatever you want to call it is probably the most awkward part of the design. That does bring it down for sure. As the controller of time, it would be fun to, for example, give it the ability to completely reverse the trajectory of projectiles. Not just reflect them like we've seen before, but to actually truly have them go back the way they came. And then you could even have that maybe happen for opponents, have them show up where they just were, or even for Dialga itself, have it backtrack in time a little bit, kind of a blink ability. I guess the other thing to mention about them is canonically they're very big, but they're not the kind of big where I would necessarily feel bad about scaling them down. I think you could translate that pretty comfortably. They wouldn't feel out of place. I think space manipulation is more interesting and more distinct from what we've seen before, and Palkia again is just by far the better standalone candidate. Dialga standalone, I'm feeling more of a B tier. It feels really weird to split these up like that. I'll put them together just to keep things consistent. Maybe you want to pair them with Arceus. Maybe you want to do some kind of Hisuian trainer thing. On the topic of Hisuian stuff, their origin forms. I know these would show up in the final smashes, but I prefer they didn't. As much as I love Pokemon Legends Arceus, these guys aren't my favorite contribution that game made. I do like Giratina on the other hand, but you know what? Whether we're talking about its base form or its origin form, I think they're both just way too clunky for Smash. They're too long. The base form has 6 legs and is really tall, and then the origin form has that giant tail going behind it and a bunch of stuff swinging around. I'm just gonna let it be. Yanmega, which I always think is a dragon type for some reason. Yeah, it's flappy wings. Flygon, which I always think is a bug type for some reason. Maybe that's why I always think Yanmega is a dragon type for some reason. This has some potential behind it. Dragon ground type, that's an interesting typing combination, and it means that I really don't need to apply any kind of flying penalty at all to it. In fact, just looking at it, it's kind of paunchy, right? It clearly belongs in the air. Flygon can obviously fly, but it's also not the most majestic soaring thing out there. Ground pounds could be kind of a cool theme for this one. A lot of attacks that bring it into the air and then send it slamming down again. It's got that really long whip-like tail to attack with. Could throw out some great attacks with its wings. They kind of look like blades. Got powerful legs to throw out some kicks while it's hovering. Yes, I'm talking about aerials, but also what if, say, for example, its forward tilt was a side kick while it's lifting itself off the ground with its wings. Not much potential for its arms, but it makes up for that with a lot of headbutting, including maybe whipping at you with those horns/ears. I'm not 100% sure what those are. In any case, yeah, my imagination started running wild with this one. It's really easy to picture. Absolutely zero Echo Fighter potential to speak of, though. This one has a pretty wild evolutionary line. Then Zygarde from the Kalos Legendary Trio, so definitely the odd one out here. It was clearly supposed to be the central focus of Pokemon Z, which just never happened along with X and Y. Yeah, chiming in from the future here, that aged like milk. But part of the upside to that is I think you can very easily separate it from the other two. Also helps that out of the three of them, I think it has by far the most standalone potential. The way it works in Pokemon is you can choose between the 10% dog or the 50% snake, and then if their health goes below 50%, it turns into that final mecha thing. So there's kind of a built-in formula for that in Smash, right? Kind of a Zelda-chic dynamic between the first two forms, and then maybe whenever you're over 100% damage, you change into a completely new moveset, just a comeback mechanic on total steroids kind of thing. Now, personally, I'm really not a big fan of that final form. I think it's massively over-designed, but in terms of sheer moveset potential, I gotta admit there's a lot there. It's a solid biped design, and then on top of that, it's got those arms/ribbon things, which actually have mouths on the end of them. And then this thing also just has so many signature moves. You could pluck an entire set of specials just out of those. Yeah, okay, fine, I'll give it the S tier. The snake is definitely pulling things down for me, and also I'm just personally biased against it a bit, but I gotta admit, it's got a lot going for it, some interesting mechanics, a lot of interesting moves. I'll live with it. Weavile. It's a speedy ice type with sharp claws, great body shape, it's a fan favorite. I mean, we know this one works in a fighting game context, right? It fits so naturally into Pokken, it was ridiculous. My only caveat is that I don't think it's necessarily doing anything standalone insane that other Pokemon don't bring to the table as well, but all the pieces really do come together quite nicely. It's also competing with Sneasler, the Hisuian variant. Now, on paper, this one's pretty much equally as good. It was used as one of your mounts in Pokemon Legends against Arceus, and I really like the way it was implemented. So it might even be fun to see the trainer on its back and being used in a similar way. Would be a cool method of bringing the Pokemon trainer into the fight without getting too involved if you wanted to take that approach, and I think a Pokemon trainer trio made entirely out of Hisuian mounts would be interesting. Personal bias against it, I think it looks kind of dumb. It's a sharp downgrade from Weavile, but that's subjective. I know some people really like it. Its signature move, Dire Claw, would be fun too. It's a slashing attack that leaves a random status effect on an opponent. You could see that being implemented as either a special move or just a forward smash with some kind of status effect attached to it, which we haven't seen anything like that in Smash. I'd be on board. A little bit degenerate, a little bit anti-competitive, but it would be entertaining, and provided you didn't push it too far, I think it'd be fine. Yeah, okay, I'll let them both slip into S tier. It's kind of a borderline case for me, but they got their own merits. And then both Sneasels, whether we're talking about the default or the Hisuian variant, work well too. I think it'd definitely work better for Weavile than Sneasler. The proportions just fit more, but you could kind of make it work for either of them, and solid either way. Chandelure, another Pokken veteran. This is not another Weavile case where I think it fits seamlessly into both. It made way more sense in Pokken than it does in Smash to me. The body type is just a little bit weird, and it needs to hover off the ground in kind of an awkward way. Not the most disastrous of anything on the roster, mind you. It does have quote-unquote arms that it could punch with, and it could even extend those arms out with flames for different attacks. Ghost Fire continues to be a very cool typing, and it learns a lot of interesting moves that could fit into those. It's becoming a pretty competitive typing though, you know what I mean? I'm feeling more of a B tier on this one. It may be a bit of a controversial placement. I'm expecting a lot of people to be in Chandelure's corner, but I just think Pokken is a better home for it. When I look at this and then I look at the stuff I'm placing in the higher tiers, it just feels kind of limited to me. Lampent does technically work as a clone if you don't want to make those flames on Chandelure's body a focus of its moveset at all. I don't know why you wouldn't though. Litwick is a candle. Eternatus, Scarlet and Violet's big bad. I used to be super against this thing. I thought it was complete trash. Now, over the years, I have softened on it a bit. I get what they're going for. I still think the edgy skeleton dragon looks way more like a Yu-Gi-Oh card than anything, but having the cannon in the middle of its body is kind of cool. It does make some sense in context. I like it more than Ultra Necrozma. I'll give it that. This is purely talking about my opinions in Pokemon though. Bringing things back to Smash, it does not belong in there. Just way too awkward. Krickadoon. On paper, I kind of like this one. It's got the scythe blade arms, it's got a music theme to it, relatively decent body shape. Legs are a bit stubby, but you could make it work. If we're going scythe arms though, the Scyther line's right there. If we're going the music theme, there's so many better options, and most of those competitors, let's be honest, are just more interesting than it. At the end of the day, it's a relatively bland bug type. Doesn't come with a clone either. Boltund, another dog. We've looked at a lot of these today, so what's it bringing to the table? What's this unique angle? Oh, speedy electric type? Meh. I'm gonna go ahead and put Yamper in the same tier instead of just use the evolution. It's a slower, roly-poly kind of dog. I actually think it stands out a bit more. Darkspun, another dog that we've looked at a lot of today. What's his unique angle? What's it bringing to the table? It's a fairy type made out of bread. Okay, that is more unique at least. What do you really do with that though? You could make it like a slower armored take on things. You know, baking itself into tougher bread. Its signature ability is well-baked body, which kind of plays into that a bit. Not really though. Well-baked body specifically interacts with fire type moves. I'm just putting it with the others. We're really forcing things here. I do like this one as a Pokemon though. If you really wanted to, you could slip Fido in as a clone, but why? Houndstone, another dog like we've looked at a lot of today. What's his unique angle? What's it bringing to the table? It's dead. That is something different, I gotta give it that. This one also fittingly has a bit of a burying itself in the ground theme. It's not super strong or integral to the Pokemon or anything like that, but it is something. I could picture an up smash animation, for example, where it buries itself in the ground for the charge up, so it gets really low profiled, and then it springs up and attacks with the tombstone on its head. It learns last respects, which in Pokemon powers up every time a teammate goes down. You couldn't obviously directly translate that into Smash, but you could maybe have it power up each time a Houndstone respawns. That's potentially getting into kind of iffy mechanical territory, but maybe if you just cap it off once, right? Saying that for the first stock, that special move or wherever you decide to stick it is weaker, but then the first time that Houndstone loses a stock and respawns, it's powered up more for the rest of the fight. That's pretty reasonable, right? You could make that work. I'll give it a C tier. It's not brilliant, but I do think it's a step up from some of the other pooches. Greavard's a pretty solid clone too. You would need to replace the tombstone attacks with candle-based attacks, but that's not too big a stretch. And that could be the standout element too. Drapion, always been a fan of this one. It's easy to picture this as a big poison heavyweight, always just an inherent fan of that concept, and it's got a sturdy shell in the Pokedex, so you can imagine it would probably have some armor-based attacks on it. Ties into the theme very naturally. The Pokedex also talks about how it relies on its incredible strength instead of using poison, but it does have poison imbued into its claw tip, so it would have, for example, extremely strong smash attacks that also do damage over time if they connect. Maybe all of its arm attacks do that, right? That's what gives it that heavyweight power boost. So for example, its forward tilt, I could easily see it doing a big lunge with those claws, almost a sword style poke, and then if it connects, you're poisoned for a couple seconds. I'm actually super into that idea. This is a place where I could easily see Bug Buzz being pulled out for recovery purposes and make it a relatively mediocre recovery. And that's both because it's sort of how heavyweights tend to be designed in Smash, even if I personally disagree with that design philosophy, and also because Drapion spends all his time buried, so why would it be super mobile in the air? S tier, that's scratching a lot of itches for me. Skorupi's a fun Pokemon, but too different. Maractus. We're back into the territory of music-based Pokemon being a really competitive category. I don't know what this is necessarily doing that other Pokemon aren't. Has no legs, so the body shape's awkward. I think it's outclassed by Cacturne, which is itself outclassed by stuff. I think Upstage may honestly even feel a bit too generous. Who remembers Maractus?
There are dozens of us. Dozens!
But I'll be consistent. Hippowdon. Fan favorite Pokemon, but it comes with a lot of baggage. It has that upstage thing going on with the ground types that's just a really hard niche to fill. And it's also just hard to picture moving around in a platform fighter. It's too slow and too bulky. Trying to imagine this jumping at all is just kind of strange. I'll give it a D tier even if it probably deserves an F. Hippopotas would make for a very fitting semi-clone though. Terrapagos, kind of the beating heart of Scarlet and Violet's region. Just because it powers Terrestrialization in Paldea though, I'm gonna be honest, I don't really know what it's supposed to be doing in Smash. It's got 3 forms, out of which I think its base form is actually the most fitting, but that's not really what it uses. It always transforms in combat. And in that case, it's a pancake. And then when it terrestrializes into its stellar form, I really don't know what you're supposed to do with that. Look, between Ogerpon and the Loyal 3, there are some really fun legendaries in Gen 9 to pull from. Terrapagos, I don't think is one of them. Another case where upstaged even maybe seems too high. I really don't think it fits, but I'll be generous, I guess. After all, it is an extremely important Pokemon story-wise. Zoroark. Okay, this is one where I need to stretch things more than I usually do, because its signature ability is that it disguises itself. It comes out looking like a different Pokemon on your team, and then the disguise gets dropped later on. That's how it works in the Overworld for Scarlet and Violet 2, for example. It starts out looking like a completely different Pokemon, and then that disguise gets dropped when you interact with it. You can't really make that work in Smash. Now, I can think of a way it could technically happen. You could, for example, hold down the left and right triggers while you're selecting a different character on the character select screen, so then your opponent thinks you're picking that character, but then the first time you do an attack or get hit or whatever in-game, the disguise is broken and it turns out you're actually playing Zoroark. Now, that's a really convoluted system to add for one character for very little payoff, so we're probably not taking that route. I think the more logical route is to approach things very loosely and have Zoroark just do a very illusion-based moveset, which is kind of wishy-washy, and I've talked a lot about how I value very concrete references. The more you can just pull directly out of the Pokemon series, the better. But I don't think it's too much of a stretch, especially if you start folding the show in and stuff like that, and illusion moves is such a strong concept to work with. This is pretty much what Pokemon Unite does, right? And it just works so well there, too. And really all of this can be said about its Hisuian variant, too. Fans absolutely ate this one up, and it could be a really cool Echo Fighter with more moves focused on its main than the basic Zoroark. It's coming in with a fantastic body type for a fighting game, the clawed hands and feet, that tail slash mane. So even though you need to use your imagination more than with a lot of these, I'm totally on board with S tier, and Hisuian Zoroark would be a great clone. I think we can take a pass on Zorua though. Manectric, another relatively speedy electric, what I think is supposed to be a dog. I'll put it with the other speedy electric dog. And Electrike is another of those serviceable but why kind of clones. Cutiefly and Rabombi, I'm gonna give Flappy Wings. You could make a bit of a case for Rabombi. It does have legs even if it doesn't really use them, so you could have it kind of dragging its legs along the ground as it uses its wings to fly. You know what, I'm kind of talking myself out of this one. Don't get me wrong though, it's getting upgraded to F tier. I could not care less. And then Venomoth, kind of an inverse scenario. The evolved form is clearly Flappy Wings, and then Venonat, its pre-evolution, is not Flappy Wings at all, but is going in F tier. Victini. Even though this one is not an electric type, it's fire psychic, it's coming dangerously close to being a Pikachu. It's a legendary Pokemon, a mythical specifically. It barely looks like it though. You could tell me this was a Route 1 catch in an old game and I'd barely question it. It's got Mew stats, hundreds across the board. A few signature moves. Searing Shot is essentially upgraded Flamethrower. V-Create is a close combat kind of move, so you could make it a very high risk, high reward burst movement option. That's kind of sounding like Flare Blitz on Charizard though. Yeah, I'm not really feeling Victini. I'll give it a C tier because it works perfectly fine technically, but there's so much overlap with stuff already in Smash and it just doesn't really excite me to begin with. Even if it's not actually a Pikachu, it has a very similar body shape, and I don't really know how much of those speedy little mouse type Pokemon we need in Smash. They're annoying at the best of times. Spinda is another one of these. I know it's based on a panda, not a mouse, but look at it versus Pikachu and it's definitely encroaching again. What I will say about this one is it could have some some very fun animations on it because its whole thing is that it's klutzy, it trips over its own feet, it spins around dizzy everywhere. You could create kind of a drunken master style and give it way more of a high risk, high reward angle compared to Pikachu, for example, which generally plays it very safe. Yeah, screw it, I'm ranking it above the mythical, go figure. Spinda also famously has a huge number of variants because its spots are randomly generated. Imagine putting that into Smash. It still has the typical 8 skins of different colors, but every time you boot up the game, its skins are just a bit different. I honestly don't really know the viability of that from a coding perspective, but assuming you could make it work and create its texture as some kind of procedurally generated thing, that'd be a fun touch. Avalugg. The body type is a really awkward combination of quadrupedal and low to the ground, moves really slowly as a glacier. Even though it comes with a Hisuian variant, I'm pretty comfortable just writing these off. And I'm just gonna go ahead and do the same with the Zebstrika line. Do you want a quick electric type? Do you want a quadruped? Do you want specifically a horse? Make your pick, there's always a better option available. It's just a bland Pokemon to begin with. Passimian is another relatively bland Pokemon, but you know what? I'm willing to go to bat for this one. It's got a good body type and it comes with that ball that you could integrate into its moveset in a lot of interesting ways. It could throw it could roll around on it could use it to punch with. It is a bit bland for me to go to bat super hard for, but it fits. And then Oranguru, its counterpart. It's a slow psychic type Pokemon, which is a bit different, and then it can attack with that Leaf Fan. I don't think it's nearly as interesting as Passimian, but it is coming in with a pretty strong direction for where to take it. I guess I'm willing to give it a B tier as well, although if I had to pick between the two of them, definitely Passimian. Archaladon is interesting. New Gen 9 Pokemon, kind of a transforming deal. It's got stamina for an ability which boosts its defense every time it's hit by an attack. I think that could be a cool take on a counter type move. A bit of a twin to Incineroar's Revenge maybe, where if you counter a move, you get a combo off, but it doesn't boost your offensive stats, it boosts your defense for a while, makes you harder to kill, and then maybe gives you a boost to your recovery or something like that. I'm not totally sure how you'd handle it. It would need to be playtested pretty carefully, but the idea of a counter that's way more beneficial to you than detrimental to your opponent, that is fun and very in character for it. The body type is maybe a bit awkward and stiff, but not horrible, and then its ability to transform into a different shape for certain special moves kind of speaks for itself. You wouldn't necessarily be forced to integrate that as not a super core part of its identity, but you definitely would. An architecture-based Steel Dragon is very distinctive. Even without transforming, I could see that body type being used for some interesting attacks. I'm gonna say A tier. And then Duraludon, now it's pre-evolution, which used to be its own standalone Pokemon. I think it works okay in its own right, but it doesn't really have a lot of standout stuff that would make me lean towards it over Archaladon. And then its core body type is probably just too different. It can't transform, it doesn't have the spikes on its elbows. Would probably need to change quite a bit for really not that much payoff. Arcanine, another what I think is supposed to be a dog. If it is, it's probably the all-time fan favorite dog. And then its body shape is also pretty good for a quadruped, very upright, not too long. It's got a big tail to work with. Given the choice between the two, I would definitely choose Hisuian Arcanine. Not only is it more distinctive than the original Arcanine in terms of typing, Fire's not really bringing all that much to Smash, Rock is, and it's also got that spike on its head. It's not a massive element of its design, and any headbutted attacks that it did, you could fit on a base Arcanine too, but they would definitely feel a lot more natural here, and it's representing Pokemon Legends Arceus in addition to a Gen 1 Pokemon. Now, on a personal level, I still prefer the original, but as far as Smash candidates go, I'll put Hisuian Arcanine in A tier, and the original can be the Echo Fighter, along with both Growlithe. These are actually pretty good. Beheeyem, an alien-based Pokemon, is fun. It should be more fun, though. This thing's surprisingly forgettable. It's got a very loose alien abduction theme going on with a couple of its moves, but you would probably need to stretch to turn that into a coherent moveset, which is somewhat reasonable, but how much are you really getting out of that, especially because it's a pure psychic type, which is definitely taken. It's a pretty textbook C tier, functional but not interesting, and Elgyem works fine as an Echo Fighter. The alien-themed Pokemon I like more is Orbeetle, or UFO-themed Pokemon, I guess in this case. Has more interesting potential for movement. It could kind of hover just off the ground UFO style while its feet still drag. Its limbs are pretty stubby. It would have trouble doing too many melee attacks. It could make heavy use of the Carapace, which is something, but you're still probably going to run out of stuff to do eventually. I guess it's not crazy to think about using the separated wings as kind of surrogate arms. I'll give it a B tier. It works decently well, has some personality, and the concept of an alien Pokemon is fun. Its pre-evolutions aren't much of anything though. Miltank is an infamously bulky Pokemon from the earlier generations. As far as implementing it into Smash, other than maybe some kind of healing mechanic from drinking the milk, it's really just reminding me of Snorlax over again. Self-healing's a bit more of a refreshing angle, but Snorlax is definitely the more iconic Pokemon, so I think overall they kind of balance out to the same place. Melmetal. This thing's made out of liquid metal and in lore has a focus on really heavy punches, so the moveset kind of writes itself. Almost a bit of a Terminator 2 vibe going on. That said, I hate looking at it. It is so dull. It was chosen to be like the signature mythical of Pokemon Go, which is a really strange call for me. The vibes between, hey, get up and go outside and explore the world, and then this just cold, heartless, industrial thing clash so harshly, I don't get it. I can see this being an S, I really could, but I'm bumping it all the way down to B because if this thing ever steals a playable character slot in Smash, I'm gonna be legitimately upset. And Miltank is too stubby and lacking a lot of components. Obstagoon, this is a fun one. It's got hooligan, delinquent vibes going on. I think it might be partially based on a bouncer, and then maybe Kiss, like the band Kiss is thrown in there as well. It has a lot of messing with your opponent kind of moves. I could see Obstruct being put on there, for example, as yet another take on a counter where if you pull it off successfully, your opponent gets a debuff of some kind on them for a bit. And then on top of just being a very personality-rich design, it gets a lot of personality conveyed to it in-game too. Its abilities are Reckless, which increases recoil moves power, or Guts, which boosts its attack when it's statused, or Defiant, which boosts its attack when its stats are lowered. So this is all speaking to me as a very high-risk, high-reward playstyle that also screws with your opponent. You put some kind of debuff on them, and then you go in with one of your Reckless options to try and get some insane payoff. And if it goes too poorly, it all blows up in your face. That's a lot of fun. And then when you pair that with being one of the standout designs of Gen 8, yeah, I think S tier's fair. All of the Zigzagoons and Lanoons, though, look, I like them as someone with a lot of Gen 3 nostalgia, but they don't belong in Smash. Another nostalgic pick that doesn't belong in Smash, Starmie. This is one of my favorite Gen 1 Pokemon. I can't tell you why, there's so little going on with it, but that's part of what makes me like it. It's elegant in its own way and it's kind of mysterious, but it's F tier. Doesn't necessarily need to be floppy fish. It's psychic type. You can see this one floating around in the air pretty comfortably, but after you've done that, you're left with a disc. Veluza, that one's getting no such concession though. That's as floppy fish as it gets. Swalot. Yeah, ew. Goodra. It's one of the more straightforward dragons. It does have a couple interesting quirks going on with it though. It attacks with those tendrils on its head, and then as you'd imagine, it's also covered in goo, which gives it some defensive utility and also makes it sticky. It's easy to picture this one being a grappler. It likes to hug, but it would also be funny if you gave it a command grab where the opponent was just stuck to its actual body. It's not even needing to grab onto them. Other than that, a bit unremarkable overall, but those are some interesting details. When you get to Hisuian Goodra, I start to get more interested because it comes with all of the same quirks as base form Goodra, but it also has that gigantic shell tail. It can retract into it for different attacks, it can use it as a club, and I don't even think you're necessarily giving up anything that the base form Goodra has, because according to the Hisuian Pokedex, it can control the hardness of that shell. So if you wanted to use it more flexibly, I think according to lore that is an option on the table. With all that coming together, I think Hisuian Goodra gets S tier, and then base form Goodra and all the pre-evolutions just feel kind of redundant. You may say, well, why not use Goodra as an Echo Fighter? I think you lose quite a bit with the lack of a shell, considering you'd probably want to use that for lots of the moveset of Hisuian Goodra. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, the Hisuian variant is pretty much just a strict upgrade. Ninjask and Shedinja. This is one of my favorite unique Pokemon evolution concepts. Nincada evolves into Ninjask and sheds its shell, which becomes an entirely different Pokemon. As far as Smash goes, they're Flappy Wings. And that whole thing where Shedinja has Wonder Guard and can only be hit by super effective attacks. Again, cool concept for Pokemon, does not work in Smash. It's just too high concept. Cloth. He's just a crab. He's just a goofy little crab trying to make his way through the world. Totally redundant with all the crabs we already have and definitely didn't need to be a thing, but he's fun. Wheezing. Multiple heads is always a fun angle. They have neutralizing gas, which as far as Pokemon goes is a great troll. It shuts off all other abilities. Not necessarily super translatable to Smash, you would just need to create something smog based out of it, and we kind of have that with Piranha Plant. And besides what I've just mentioned, they're really not doing much, even if the Galarian form does have a fun concept behind it. That top hat slash smokestack thing's nice design. Gigalith. It's a very crystalline rock type Pokemon, which has some overlap with Deontay in particular, but it's obviously a very different body type, a quadruped, and a quadruped design that I think actually works pretty well for Smash, a very upright one, and it's also much more your classic just like big hulking rock type. So there are a few different angles you could go with it. You could have it be that big hulking rock type, sort of a representation of the typing, give it moves like Rock Blast, Rock Tomb, Rock Polish, or you could play into that crystal angle more and give it multiple beam style attacks like it can learn in the Pokemon games, or more reasonably both. I'm almost tempted to go A tier on this one, but you know, if we're talking about the more straightforward textbook rock typing, I think Golem probably does a better job. If we're doing the crystalline thing, I still would rather take Deontay. I think there's more there. A very solid B tier though. Not as much for the smaller rocks. Bramblegast. What do you want from me here? Delmise. What do you want from me here? Comfy. What do you want from me here? Ferrothorn. What do you want from me here? Okay, no, this one's actually worth talking about. We've talked about bipeds, we've talked about quadrupeds, not too many tripeds running around. On very flexible vine stalks with clawed feet too, so there would be some moveset potential there. It's a bit of a pancake design, so potentially too low to the ground, but that's fixable depending on how you choose to animate it. You can just have it stand higher up, and in that case, it's actually not too bad. If you want to take that supported by vines angle, Ivysaur does steal some of that design space, but you could lean harder into it. In fact, you'd have to lean harder into it. I don't think that's inherently too bad. It's a slow defensive grass steel type, some interesting design territory to work with there, would be a good candidate for moves like Leech Seed, Iron Head, Power Whip. Still probably a bit on the clunky, awkward side, but there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, enough to make me want to try and work with it. When it comes to Pharaoh Seed, yeah, what do you want from me here? Grumpig. Pure Psychic type, kind of unremarkable on the surface, has a couple interesting traits going on for it. It's known for being able to completely manipulate opponents by dancing strangely. That could create some cool, for example, throw animations. Have your opponent kind of throw themselves, and then it's got that springy tail it bounces around on you. You get a couple fun moves out of that. I'm feeling kind of a surprised B tier. It's a very unremarkable Pokemon. I always forget this thing exists. That said, as far as Smash potential goes, it's not bad. Spoink is just too simple though. Infernape, which I guess brings us to the Gen 4 starters, our last line here. This is a home run as far as I'm concerned. I know that firefighting has been leaned on too heavily, but even ignoring the fact that this is one of the earlier ones, so we wouldn't really penalize it too much yet, it still might be the pinnacle of that type combination for me. It does risk getting folded up into, say, Blaziken's identity a bit in particular, but it's got the long tail it can use for attacks, it's got that flame on its head, it takes inspiration from Chinese warriors, so it could have a very different moveset basis. Its personality is nothing particularly spectacular. It's again one of these kind of Goku-ish characters, not something we have a short supply of either in Smash or as candidates for Smash, but that could still come to life by using Raging Fury, for example, as a charge up into a very unsafe burst movement option, because in Pokemon it's used for a few turns and then confuses the user. Again, the identity of that overlaps with Flare Blitz a bit, which is already in Smash obviously, but I think you could separate it mechanically enough in a way that would fit comfortably into the game. It's got the Iron Fist ability, and I mean, hey, look at it, that makes sense. So you could have it using all sorts of powerful punching attacks, again with a bit of a Chinese martial arts twist to it. Then we get to Empoleon, which I'm going to say is not nearly as obvious a fit, but it is definitely more distinctive. You hear big Emperor Penguin inspiration, and your first thought might be that it's some kind of heavyweight bruiser, which makes sense, and that's kind of how it's interpreted in Pokken too. But if you just look at its body, the elements that are the most obvious attack sources, that trident-shaped beak, the wings, they're not nearly as chunky as you may expect. They're actually a bit flimsy looking, which makes sense in context because Empoleon is actually a special attacker in Pokemon. So you'd expect it to be using a lot of attacks like Hydro Pump, Scald, Brine, and Brine in particular seems like a really good fit here, because even if you're going more the direction of turning Empoleon into a heavy zoner, it's still going to be a heavyweight. And Brine powers up as the Pokemon takes damage, which obviously has a lot of inherent synergy with the heavyweight archetype who's supposed to be surviving. That's not to discount elements like the wings and trident and belly, though. You could definitely turn that into a pretty coherent close combat moveset. And then that brings us to Torterra, which is my personal favorite out of the three. It's the one that I used in Diamond back in the day. I do think it's easily the worst fit for Smash, though. First up, the obvious, quadruped is a pretty distinctive category in Smash. It's one of the elements that makes you stand out as a character, so the fact that there are only two in the game right now, and one of them is also a grass starter, that's treading on some toes for sure. The tree, while I do really like it from a design standpoint, it's not often you see asymmetrical elements on Pokemon like this. It makes things awkward to implement as one of those situations where you would either need to cheat with the hurt box or have the hurt box faithfully represent the tree, and then it's just a really big, tall, awkward character, not really associated with vines in the same way that Ivysaur is. And its subtype is ground, which brings us to another one of these situations where, yeah, ground is a really cool typing with a lot of potential for a platform fighter, but man, the Pokemon that fit most naturally into it are hard to compete with. Infernape S tier, zero hesitation on that one. I think Empoleon's joining it. I have a soft spot for heavy zoners, but even if I didn't, it's just got such a strong, obvious identity. Giant penguin, it's fun. Torterra is more of a B tier, and honestly, if I didn't like it so much, I could easily drop it down to C. As far as clones go, Monferno is excellent. It doesn't have that same flame on its head, so you would need to change any of Infernape's moves that used it, but that could easily be the separator between them. And then Chimchar also lacks the long tail, so you would need to change more of its moves, but again, I think that's a fair differentiator. Prinplup is also very solid. I'm personally not a big fan of this one, but it does work. By the time you get to Piplup, I think it's just too stubby. This one I could still see working as a pretty decent lower stage in like another Pokemon trainer situation though. You could still have it attacking with the fins. Its big head would be fun to throw moves out with. Okay, let's just do this and keep them all bundled together again. That does leave us with the Torterra line though. Nah, you know what, for them, I'm staying just use the evolution. They're about the same as Torterra, minus the tree, which is the most interesting part part of the design. I like both of them personally, but I'm not even super big on using Torterra, so I definitely don't want to be using them. And also, if you're going to make another Pokemon Trainer 2.0 with different starters, they don't all need to be from the same generation. In fact, I'd prefer they weren't. So just because the other two lines are really good doesn't mean the Torterra line needs to be just shoved in there with them. Orthworm is a big, heavy, awkward metal snake. Yeah, that can go right beside Steelix. Centiskorch can go down there too. This one is marginally more interesting. It does stay upright. It does have the legs scattered all throughout it, so you could have it contort itself into different positions that would almost be something resembling a moveset, but I don't think it's there. Spiritomb is a super awkward design, and I'm kind of inclined to write it off. That said, it does play an interesting role in Gen 4, where the first time you're supposed to see it is in that infamous Cynthia fight, which is supposed to be a shocking moment, right? It's like, oh, she's really hard, and here's this new Pokemon that you've never seen before that looks really sinister. It's effective there. One of my patrons was working on like a fan's Cynthia Pokemon Trainer moveset, and at one point Spiritomb was in the lineup. I don't think it is anymore, and frankly I think if you tried to include it, it would be difficult to make work, but not necessarily completely impossible. As a standalone fighter, I just straight up don't like it, but as part of that specific Pokemon Trainer concept, and I think if you're going to turn any one trainer in the Pokemon series into its own standalone Smash character, Cynthia may be the best candidate, honestly. I'm still not totally sold on it, but I'll let it slip into C tier? Maybe more like D tier. C stands for Cynthia, why not? Jumpluff would be essentially a grass version of Jigglypuff that attacked with those puffs on its head / body, because it's all kind of the same thing here. We definitely don't need 2 Jigglypuffs. A lot of people would say we don't need 1 Jigglypuff, and it's definitely got more to offer than its pre-evolutions. Druddigon. Considering what high regard dragons tend to be held in the Pokemon games, this one's pretty forgettable. I mean, what are its features? It lives in a cave, it's cold-blooded. Those aren't particularly interesting traits. It does have an extremely hard head. That's the thing that would be any kind of interest to translate into Smash. You could make it completely invulnerable, give it a lot of armor-based attacks that lead with that head, that kind of thing. Is that really an interesting enough design direction to push it over the top, especially when we have so many other dragons, including most of the pseudo-legendaries and great armor candidates? I'm just putting it in upstage as well. Quagsire. It's a pretty basic Pokemon functionality-wise. Its biggest claim to fame is just being stupid and not really caring about what's going on around it. That could make for some fun animations. And you know, its body type's not awful. It could crash its body into things. It's got that big tail to work with. I find it more funny than anything else, though. It's known for not really moving around. It just kind of lies in the water with its mouth gaping open, and that's how it eats. Yeah, it's a comedy tier. As for Clodsire, the Gen 9 branch, I love this thing. This is one of my favorite Gen 9 Pokemon. Love its look, love its role as the typical poison setup Pokemon, love its personality, love those spines coming out of its back. That's a fantastic touch. Does any of that make it a good Smash candidate? Absolutely not. It's far worse than Quagsire, but Clodsire is also funny. As for the Whoopers, they're not bad in their own right, but I think you definitely need to evolve them to get the full appeal. While we're talking about Gen 9 branches, Applin doesn't really do all that much by itself, but it's got up to 3 things it can turn into. All depends on what kind of apple you show it. I'm not willing to say that any of these are incredible. The best is probably the newest one, Hydrapple, a whole bunch of dragon worms all stuck into a single apple. You've got Fickle Beam as the signature move here, and its whole gimmick is that sometimes it just randomly gets way more powerful. I think the concept behind it is it's all the heads kind of coming together and working as one just for a bit. I'm not convinced that a projectile with random power spikes is necessarily super healthy design for Smash, so probably just make that like a chargeable thing where more heads get visibly involved as you power it up. You've got Syrup Bomb, which as you'd expect messes with speed, so you could shoot it onto the ground to create a sticky patch kind of like Inkling Ink, and on hit it could reduce movement stats for a bit, so think maybe Plankton with his sauce from Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2. Those are functional projectiles. I don't think they're anything particularly standout and potentially pretty unhealthy depending on how much you want to stick to the Pokemon mechanics for them though. And as far as close quarters attacks, I think this is really only interesting if you're involving a bunch of heads at once. With one, its moveset potential is pretty limited, and also it's probably not a viable body shape. Appleton, the one based on Apple Pie, it's a fun Pokemon design, but as far as trying to put it into Smash goes, it's another one that just kind of comes across as Diet Ivysaur to me. Apple Acid could be translated as kind of a cool projectile. It would be a slow one that either eats through shield very rapidly, or it could make you vulnerable on hit, make you lighter or take additional damage for a bit, something like that, or both. I'm not sure how much of a selling point I necessarily think that is. And then you've got Flapple, and out of the 3 of them, this is probably the most awkward in a trio that's all kind of awkward. It's got that classic hovering above the ground problem. Because it's sitting on kind of a bowl from the bottom of the apple, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world Overworld to have just sort of scraping the ground, but not ideal, and even ignoring that problem, it's too stiff, it can barely move. The worm may have joints, but the worm's too stubby to really do anything, and the apple doesn't have joints. I'll give Hydrapple like a C tier as the most interesting one of these. The multiple heads thing is kind of fun. Appleton is more of a D tier, and Flapple, nah. As for the pre-evolutions that are just apples, I don't know where I'm supposed to be going with that. Masharna, this bizarre fetus tapir thing. So trying to picture this in Smash, it floats around curled up in a sleep and attacks with that tendril, cloud, umbilical cord, whatever the hell it is. Yeah, I don't know about that one. Well, we're talking about psychic Pokemon with unworkable body types, Rabsca. I think it's one of the more intriguing bug types they've ever made, but it's gonna have to stay intriguing in Pokemon. Bronzong. I feel like it should be in the same camp and I should hate it, but I kinda don't. It's almost there. It's really big and chunky, so having it hover so that it's almost touching the ground really wouldn't look out of place. And it's got those two arm flap things, so it has more moveset potential than some of these objects inspired by real world items, especially metal ones. That body type almost ends up as something interesting and unique, but I think at the end of the day it still does fall more towards unworkable. The actual torso slash head isn't very flexible, and there ultimately just isn't that much to work with, even for a psychic type that can do some more manipulation stuff. You know, I think I'll give it a D tier instead of an F, because at the very least I had to think about it for half a second, but that's definitely the best I can do, and I can probably do worse. It wouldn't be the world's worst Pokken candidate, let's put it that way. And Bronzor is a considerable step down even from that. Chimecho, similar camp, it's another psychic type with exactly one flexible element that it could realistically use for fighting, except this time it's smaller and more awkward, and if it had to swing that part of it around, then it would be well above the ground for most of its attacks. It's kind of a mess. Easy F tier on those. Magearna. This one's interesting. It's a mythical Pokemon that's like mechanical and pops out of a Pokeball. The gear clockwork thing is fun, and you could probably make some stuff happen with that. You could use Shift Gear as some kind of self-inflicted speed boost option. It's got Fleur Cannon as its signature move, which is one of these options that's super powerful but makes you suffer a penalty after losing it. There are a couple ways I could see that being translated. You could just make it a bigger, heavier, slower version of something like Rob's Robo Beam, but you could also go for a more direct translation and have it be a quite powerful projectile, but you take some kind of stat loss for a bit after you use it. You could have some attacks where it rolls into its ball, again kind of a slower, heavier Crag from Rivals of Ether type situation, but it also doesn't need to completely transform. You could just have, say, the bottom half of it fold back into the Pokeball for a down air maybe, or letting it pivot on that axis more for something like a forward or up smash, have it just swing its upper body around. Its signature ability Soul Heart powers it up every time another Pokemon faints, which includes allies and opponents. That would have some interesting interactions in team fights. For one-on-one, it's more of a snowball effect, almost a reverse comeback mechanic. You get stronger as your opponent keeps losing. Interesting. Sounds maybe a bit toxic, honestly. We'd also need to work out how that changes in different formats, time-based versus different amounts of stocks, for example. I still like it though. There's a lot you could do with that clockwork transformation angle, got a lot of interesting moves. Solid A tier. Vikavolt isn't exactly classic flappy wings, but it's probably the best home for it. It's just way too long and low. And its pre-evolutions are just lumps. Speaking of lumps, here's a whole bunch of lumpy, how do you even get off the ground with these guys kinds of Pokemon. You can always make it work if you want to force it enough. The question is, how much do you want to force it? So Mamoswine. It could get launched into the air by ice bursting up underneath its feet, or ground bursting up underneath its feet, or both. Mix them together and get kind of a permafrost or tundra vibe. So what do you get out of that? What's its hook? Tusks, and not really a whole lot else, honestly. You could definitely cobble some Tusk attacks together, don't get me wrong, but definitely not enough to fill a whole moveset out of. Its body is just too stubby, so if it wants to swing its tusks around, it basically has to carry its entire weight with it. Well, okay, in that case, maybe have it lean into that aspect more and really hurl itself towards you. Have a lot of momentum-based and tackling attacks in there, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but there are so many Pokemon we've looked at you'd expect to be using a lot of body slam style moves. Is this really cream of the crop? It's ice type, and you know what? I think you could make the ice angle of that work, have its tusks coated in ice for some moves, that kind of thing. Its other typing is ground though, and again we're back in that category of wow, ground is tough. Then we have another ice type, Lapras, ice water in this case. I've been very resistant to helping water types out by, for example, having them constantly surfing around with water under their feet, kind of like Squirtle does, because there are so many Pokemon that don't need that kind of crutch, right? But Lapras does look like it would fit relatively comfortably on land, but could also maybe use a bit of help to be more mobile, so I might be willing to go there for this one. It's also a very well-liked classic Pokemon, and it's a ride Pokemon, so if you wanted wanted to take that approach of making a Pokemon Trainer 2.0 where you ride around on a bunch of different Pokemon, this could be the surfing one. The flippers kind of fall into the same category as Mamoswine's tusks, where you need to contort yourself quite a bit to make use of them, but I think it's still probably better because they're at least flexible. And then you also have that strong head on a neck that's long, but not too long. It's workable. Gastrodon is kind of a mix of all the comments I've made so far. It's water ground with a long neck. I think it falls into kind of an awkward pocket compared to either of the other two, but I really like Gastrodon. I couldn't exactly tell you why. Some of that comes from having maybe my favorite cry in the entire Pokemon franchise. They're just goobers. Camerupt, it's relatively easy to see how this one will get into the air. It jets itself off with little eruptions under its feet. Besides that, it's a pretty straightforward slam its body into you type Pokemon. That's really most of what it could do. It does have pretty thick, sturdy hooves that it could use for some attacks. Not the best. The one major exception, of course, being those mini volcanoes on its back. Any upwards facing attack, up tilt, up smash, up air, you're covered. You could probably jet it all over the place depending on how willing you are to turn it around. Heatran would probably use the same technique to get into the air, but I kind of hesitate with this one because it has way better legs than Camerupt, or basically anything else on this list. So it honestly probably could just kind of jump around, right? Although I still think the mini eruptions would be more flavorful. And then it could use its longer legs way more effectively for attacks. And it would use a lot of powerful biting moves. The thing it doesn't have over Camerupt is those volcanoes, obviously. It does learn Magma Storm as its signature move, though. It's pretty easy to picture how that could be used as a special move, but if you wanted to, you could even maybe take it in the direction of making that Heatran smash attacks. They're all separated from its body a bit, kind of like how Palutena's up smash works, and they leave damage over time fire behind. And then Purugly, it's an ugly cat. I know some people really like this one for some reason, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a super basic Pokemon. Okay, Mamoswine's like a D tier, and that's coming pretty much entirely from the long tusks. Lapras is getting A tier, not S, it needs some help. But the more I do this, the more I'm starting to get behind that riding integrated Pokemon trainer concept, and if you wanted to go down that road, Lapras would be a super good fit. Yeah, you would need to scale it down a bit, but whatever, that's fine. You know what, let's move the Gen 9 Legendaries up with it for the same reason. Camerupt, I think I'm going to give a C tier. The ability to fire stuff out of its back does give a bit of a leg up over Mamoswine. Even then, though, it's a little too reminiscent of Ivysaur. This is kind of borderline. Still a perk that Numel doesn't have. Gastrodon is a terrible fit for Smash, but I just like them. Look at those phases. Come on. Their pre-evolutions are not funny yet. A lot of people do find Purugly pretty funny. I don't. This is just kind of one of those also ran Pokemon for me. And then Heatran, I guess, a solid upper B tier. It doesn't really do anything that stands out that much to me, but it's got the legs, it's got the fangs, a very functional quadruped, and it is a legendary. I was talking about boring cat Pokemon, Pyroar. Yeah, even with the male and female variations, they played this one super safe. Fire is by far the most obvious type to turn into a main. Doesn't really make me feel much. If they had a whole group of these things, right? They had the water main lion, the poison main lion. Then I might be able to get more in their corner, but as is, what, am I supposed to pick this over Solgaleo? Way upstaged. I may actually prefer Litleo. It hasn't had the chance to disappoint me yet. Xatu. I'm kind of debating whether this one should be flappy wings or not. It's not the worst body type, not going to be kicking you a whole lot, but it's got pretty viable wings for attacks with, and it's got that headdress, head feather thing. Could squeeze a whip attack or two out of those. It's very much associated with being able to see into the future, so it would have some kind of counter move on it for sure. Future Sight could be a good candidate here. Picture a very delayed version of Palutena's Explosive Flame where it sets a trap in place and then much later it fires. I've always had kind of a soft spot for Xatu as well. I mean, I've got a soft spot for a lot of the Gen 3s, right? But I don't know. There's something about this one that clicks with me. It's just a strong design. I'm surprising myself a bit with this one, but I think I'm willing to go B tier. It brings a lot of good stuff from the flying and psychic types to the table in ways that don't necessarily tread on the toes of what's already in Smash, and it doesn't really fall into the worst trappings that a lot of bird Pokemon do. Like Natu, for example. Durant. Okay, so Durant sucks. It's an ant. It's another one of these mortal enemy pair Pokemon like with Zangoose and Seviper. In this case, it's Heatmore, the anteater Pokemon. Heatmore isn't the worst thing out there, but it's really doing absolutely nothing unique except for being associated with Durant. Oh, it breathes fire. Oh, it's got claws. Oh, it's a fire type. Whatever. It's not even part steel, which would at least give it a bit more of an identity. I don't get why. D tier, the only way this concept works at all is if you somehow incorporate both of them, and I'm just not really seeing it. Claydol. This is sort of prototype Golurk to me. I think that one just pulls off this concept better. The spinning implication is kind of fun. You could milk it for a few interesting moves and animations, but that aside, it's going to be doing basically everything with its head because it doesn't really have real arms. Psychic and ground are both really tough to compete in. Its pre-evolution Baltoy may actually have a better body type for this, but when I look at that, I just kind of think bad Hitmontop. Alright, this is upstaged. Gumshoes, this detective-themed weasel. I'm not going to say it brings a ton to the table. The one thing that does inspire me about it is the stakeout ability. In Pokemon, it makes your attack stronger against opponents who just switched in, and I think you could have basically that exact same effect here. Give Gumshoes way more damage and hits on just the very first attack it lands each time an opponent respawns in, so it gets more reliable opening combos. There are a lot of attacks in Smash that kind of awkwardly don't combo at 0%. Gumshoes doesn't need to worry about that. It's a C tier, decent amount of style, not too much substance. And probably safe to say that Yungoos is just too different. Gothitelle, which I've always kind of thought of as being like the anti-Gardevoir. I don't know how official that is. You'd expect it to be dark, but man, this one gets really dark. It cries because it knows its trainer's lifespan. It shows people visions of the end of the universe. That does certainly give it a very clear animation direction, though. It can see the future as well, but not in the same way as something like Xatu. It does it by observing the movements of the stars, so it wouldn't have quite the same focus. It would probably actually have more of an illusion and trickery theme to it, sort of like Zoroark, although obviously way more mage-like. You know, it's another one that I'm kind of surprising myself with. I'm willing to go S tier. I think it's got a very distinctive identity, and the more I talk about it, the more it just seems like it would fit into Smash pretty well. Gothita is way too different to make work. Gothorita is not the worst. Maybe it can have a bit more of a physical focus, you know, its legs aren't entirely covered up by the skirt yet, but it doesn't really seem like a great fit. Scrafty. This one's legs are covered up, and it's fighting hard to keep it that way. The concept behind this one's fun. That's its own shed skin that it's holding up as pants, so for its entire suite of animations, you would always have it keeping one hand on its waist. It's a hoodlum Pokemon, so it's got some attitude to it. Dark fighting is not a particularly inspiring typing. It is a very good match for it, though. I think most of Scrafty's appeal just comes from the animation. That's enough for B tier, though. And Scraggy drops in as an Echo Fighter pretty well. Pangoro is surprisingly comparable. It's dark fighting type, it's got an attitude to it, it's kind of a villain. I always assumed this was supposed to be like a mob boss, a mafioso kind of thing. Bulbapedia disagrees. It seems to think it's more based on Japanese juvenile delinquent leaders. I'm still not 100% convinced, but whatever, it's mean. I'm gonna put it alongside Scrafty. It's the same deal where it's nothing super inspiring, but it would have fun animation work. In this case, I could see it doing some really fun stuff with chewing on that twig, and in this case, it's a heavyweight. There are a lot of heavyweight bears on this list. I don't think this is the absolute best one. It's fine. Pancham's on his way, but has some work to do still. Revavroom. That's a car. I know I was talking about ride Pokemon, which is the one shred of hope this thing's holding on to, but you never actually ride this in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Team Star does, but those are special, elaborate forms that don't appear anywhere else and are way too big for Smash anyways. I'm just barely okay with giving it a D tier, because if you wanted to have a Pokemon trainer who's actively in the fight like I've talked about, and it's not just like switching between 3 forms or whatever, it's where basically every single move is involving a different Pokemon. Revavroom is not the worst candidate in the entire world for, say, running around or using a side special burst option, something like that. It's not good, and I arguably shouldn't even be giving it that concession because there are Pokemon down in F tier I could say a similar thing about. If you're just willing to pull them out for one move or whatever, they can get away with a lot more. But even if you did just want to have it be like a couple of ride Pokemon, this would not be the worst nod to Team Star from Scarlet and Violet. It's borderline, but I'll allow it. Zero reason to choose its pre-evolution over it, though. Salamence. This one does belong on the ground. It's a quadruped. You can see it crawling around just fine. I don't think it feels particularly natural to be stuck on the ground, though. It's very low. It's got big wings that it really wants to be making use of. And it's also just limited when it's walking around, right? It really feels like it's supposed to be majestically soaring through the air. Other than that, you basically just have the head to work with. It makes total sense to me that its Mega Evolution just completely ditches the legs altogether. That feels like the direction it's moving in. Roaring Moon, its Paradox form, clearly takes cues from the Mega Evolution, but it also maintains the legs, and you see this one crawling around on the ground more often in Pokemon Scarlet. I will say that it works better because its wings stretch out in front of it, so you could actually use them as surrogate arms, kind of. It still seems like it might be a bit of a stretch, though. I'd call Roaring Moon a bit better, but these are both like C-tier Pokemon. Don't get me wrong, I love Salamence. That's not exactly a bold, out there opinion to begin with, and it's also the pseudo-legendary from my first generation, so of course. But I think trying to squeeze it into Smash would feel hamstrung, and apart from the quadruped thing, it is sort of veering off into Charizard territory. It doesn't have a whole lot of definitive traits of its own. You know, it's just dragon flying type. Its moveset's pretty much exactly what you'd expect. I wouldn't necessarily say the exact same thing for Roaring Moon with the dark typing, and you know what? Its body type really is a lot better. Okay, it can be B tier. Bagon, despite having the really stubby arms, is still arguably a better body type overall, but if you brought in the Salamence evolution line and didn't use Salamence, there'd be riots. As for Shelgon, that is textbook awkward middle evolution. Aggron is another one of those cool Pokemon from Gen 3, but I don't think it really has the same kind of baggage that Salamence does. This one fits into Smash pretty well. It's called the Iron Armor Pokemon, so surprise, surprise, it's getting moves like Iron Tail, Iron Defense, Heavy Slam, Metal Claw, Iron Head. It's Steel Rock type, so it would be a cool place to put something like, say, Rock Tomb as a very slow projectile. Just your quintessential slow, big bruiser heavyweight with a lot of armor-based moves. It slots in there effortlessly. It's got fantastic proportions to begin with, and it's got those horns it could use in its moveset. Big bulky tail. Yeah, Aggron's great. As for Aeron and Lairon, they're quadrupeds and they're not necessary. I think if Lairon was the final evolution, you could do worse, but if Aggron exists, be real, you're using Aggron. Pyukumuku, the sea cucumber Pokemon. So like a real sea cucumber, it can spit out its internal organs, except in this case, it turns them into like a fist to fight with. Trying to translate that into Smash is sort of fun to think about, and you can almost arrive at it working, but I'm gonna say no, it needs a bit more to it. Ariados. This is one of my favorite Pokemon. I don't really know why. I've gotten weird looks when I've brought it up before. I mostly just think it looks really cool, and I think I pulled it in my first couple of packs of Pokemon cards I was ever allowed to open, which I can't 100% remember, but if I did, that's probably when it sunk its claws in, and at this point, they're never coming out. So I really want to give it a good rating, but I don't think I can. It's very low to the ground and doesn't have a whole lot going on, and is certainly not that other bug Pokemon can't also do. The one thing in its favor is that secondary set of legs or pedipalps or whatever they are that are sticking out of its back. That would give it more to do, but it's not that much. Galvantula is its obligatory Gen 5 shameless ripoff. This one does basically everything Ariados does, plus its electric type, so it has a bit more going on for it. And I don't really mind Galvantula. I like it a lot more than many of the ripoffs. None of these really do it for me though, and at the end of the day, if we're going for a spider Pokemon, I think Spidops just blows these out of the water. It's not even close. On a weirdly similar note, Zarude, a mythical Pokemon. This one, weirdly enough, kind of works like Spider-Man 2 with those vines growing out of its wrist. It can extend those out, except it also has control over them, so it's sort of like Spider-Man with controllable webs. I don't hate that. Yes, I am just kind of describing vine control, and that's used with a lot of grass types, including an Ivysaur who's already in Smash, but Zarude does place a different emphasis on it than a lot of Pokemon do, and it fits really naturally. It's got your classic hippie healing via the earth thing going on. Its signature move is Jungle Healing, which in Pokemon is only a health restoration move. I don't like that idea in Smash very much, but I think it would make a pretty good fit for just a Shine-esque kind of move where if you make contact with it, it heals you a bit. Except it only heals you if you're touching the ground or are connected to the ground with a vine. You could make that a theme across this kit. It would be a great candidate for moves like Drain Punch and Giga Drain that it can learn. So you're starting out with Simian Spider-Man who can control the vines, and then it's got more themes that can be piled on top of that. There's a lot to work with there. Even comes with multiple obvious costume variants. You could have Default Zarude and then Dada Zarude from the movie. Yeah, S tier. I love this. We'll put it right beside Spidops. Pincurchin. Yeah, let's just drop the Sea Urchin beside the Sea Cucumber. That seems fair to me. Armaldo, another Gen 3 armor Pokemon. The Plate Pokemon this time. It's Rock/Bug, which is kind of interesting typing. It's competing against Aggron, and I'm going to say that overall it comes up a little bit short. Its arms are awkward to work with. It's got the T-Rex thing going on. They're not nearly as short and stubby as a T-Rex's arms, but definitely are some limitations by the way they're designed. Got the head it could do some bashing with. It's got the sturdy tail. I think I'm gonna go B tier for Armaldo. It's fine, there's nothing wrong with it, but we've looked at a lot of fossil Pokemon, we've looked at a lot of these Scythe Arm Pokemon, we've looked at a lot of armor Pokemon. This one's just kind of missing the X factor for me. Anorith is not much of anything. And then its counterpart, Cradily, quadrupedal grass rock type with a long neck and very stubby little legs. I think Cradely's getting upstaged tier. Yeah, it's worse than its fossil counterpart. It's worse than Shuckle if you want to take this kind of approach. Worse than the existing grass quadruped. Worse than a lot of long neck Pokemon, yeah. At the very least, it does have Lileep going for it as an Echo Fighter. If you want to do the stubby legs, long neck thing, I think Drampa's a much more interesting way to go about it. Because this one has a really long neck that it keeps coiled up, so I could almost see a little bit of a Min-Min-ish approach with extremely long-ranged attacks, but a more balanced take on Min-Min because it would still be vulnerable when it extends outwards, as opposed to Min-Min's entire arms being disjoints, which having seen it, I can safely say I don't want to see it again. It's got a wind theme, which we haven't seen a whole lot of in Smash. It would be interesting if it had a lot of moves that were really good at knocking opponents back into ideal, like, neck thrashing range, make its entire head kind of a tipper mechanic, and then give it a lot of moves that force opponents into ideal tipper range. B tier, it's got me thinking at least. Poltegeist, often not the biggest fan of object-based Pokemon. This one I can actually get behind as a Pokemon. When it comes to Smash, it's functionally just kind of a static object floating around. It's way too stubby inside the pot. Same applies to Sinistcha, which I actually like more. I ended up using this one for a little while in Scarlet, but I'm just writing all of these off. Would be fun to see them show up in a Pokeball in a future game. In DD, we've got another one of these very very defined male and female pairs where the male is more offensively oriented, the female is tankier. Their whole thing that gives them value, at least in the competitive scene, is Psychic Surge, an ability that just creates psychic terrain when they come onto the battlefield. It's another one of those. I don't really find psychic terrain as compelling as some of these other ones. It's a bit of an abstract concept to try and fit into a fighting game. The main thing it makes me think of is just Luigi's negative zone, his old Final Smash. Not saying you couldn't make it work, but you would definitely need to work harder on it. And for what payoff? There's stubby psychic types. That's not really something I'm looking for. They're very empathetic Pokemon. They're loyal to their trainers and good babysitters. Okay, I'll give them a C tier. They're in that functional but not especially inspiring area. The fact that they come as a duo is something, right? And they're like a psychically linked duo, so you could maybe have some kind of team mechanic going on there. Eldegoss. I like this as a Pokemon design, but what are you really supposed to do here other than shoot seeds at people? That's what they had to do in Pokemon Unite, right? It's just like a ranged character because it barely has limbs. There's only so many attacks you can do with that cotton head. I'm not into it. A more interesting grass type to look at here, Shaman. Its land form is kind of rough to put into Smash. It's really just a hedgehog, a blob with stubs, but then you switch over to its sky form and this works better. You've got sort of a Pikachu situation going on and a bit of an Ivysaur situation going on with a grass quadruped thing, but not totally treading on the toes of either of them. Grass flying is an interesting type combination. It seems like a very natural fit for a lot of glide style moves. That windblown kind of concept is something we've come across with other grass types, but this one also can obviously play more grounded and has a more defined, more versatile body shape. Its signature move is Seed Flare, which is pretty straightforward. It's just a damage dealer that might lower stats. In Skyform, its ability is Serene Grace, which increases the chance of moves inflicting status conditions. That could be a fun addition to Smash. Maybe give it a bit of a RNG poison element, but instead of poison, it's that flower that Jigglypuff's Rest, for example, grows on people's heads. The stronger the move, the stronger a chance it has to leave the flower. It's a relatively important Pokemon in the show. It's made a lot of appearances, gotten some strong focus. I think they'll be a B tier, and I'll keep them both together. The vision I have in my head is you spend most of your time in the Sky form, but maybe for certain attacks you transform into land form. Serena, this one's kind of cool. It's got an air of nobility to it, but those long legs are actually used for kicking attacks. It's said to be able to knock out even expert kickboxers with ease. It's also really mean, and that always leads to some fun animations. Its pre-evolution evolves after learning Stomp, which is really flavorful. It's a noble that's stomping on everything beneath it, so give it plenty of stomp and kick-based attacks. That'd be great. Could use High Jump Kick for a recovery move, throw Trop Kick on there as a forward smash or a special move, and if you wanted to, you could even lean into the flavor a bit more and have it disperse a couple of healing seeds or something like that on contact. It's got some potential to attack with the hair too. A tier, seems fun. Steamy almost works, but I think his legs are just too stubby for a Pokemon whose entire identity is based around kicking. You would need to change too much, which obviously means the piece of fruit isn't going anywhere. Golduck. I love Golduck, but it's been done pretty dirty over the years. It's not a psychic type, which makes no sense. And it's also been wildly overshadowed by Psyduck, its pre-evolution. If you're looking at the cartoon, hey, there's a Psyduck. If you're looking at live action, hey, there's a Psyduck. I think Golduck's body type is great, and the combination of psychic and water, even though it's not actually a psychic type, it does learn some psychic moves. Makes me think of a hydrokinesis water bending kind of angle. It could have moves where it floats water in midair and then swims through that water using its webbed hands and feet. As for Psyduck, we really do need to consider that one on its own terms. It would have one of those moves that's based around just sort of stumbling around and accidentally hurting people. That's always fun. Golduck, I'm going to give a B tier, and Psyduck, it's comedy tier. I'm not even going to take the Echo Fighter angle. It's its own thing. The Slowpoke line, getting into some actual water psychic stuff. Slowpoke is whatever. I'm not interested. Slowbro, on the other hand, now we're getting into something. The main point of interest is obviously that giant armored tail. That would show up in his moveset a lot, and obviously it's going to be a relatively slow-moving character, not great frame data, so its attacks are going to have to hit really hard, and that tail looks like it's going to hit really hard. And it could be boosted by more of that water bending approach. Slowking I'm less interested in because you replace the tail bashes with headbutts. That's just more inherently limited, and its own tail is really stubby, not doing much. One of Slowking's standout elements in the Pokemon series is that it can talk, and that certainly would be entertaining to see brought into Smash. And the fact that it doesn't have the absolute best body type for a fighting game is again compensated for partially by the water bending aspect. Galarian Slowking is psychic poison type, so you could do the same kind of thing with Sludge. That could be the Echo Fighter difference between them. Weaker attacks that do damage over time. Galarian Slowbro, on the other hand, is a totally different animal. That one's like a sharpshooter kind of character. Once again, it's a poison type, and you can have it shooting some poison attacks. That's cool, but in a game with Samus and Mii Gunner doing that arm cannon thing, does another one of those really excite me? I'm not so sure. Base form Slowbro and Slowking I'm going to give B tiers to. I think Galarian Slowbro is going to be just use the evolution. Galarian Slowking works pretty well as an Echo Fighter, and the Slowpokes are just fine where they are. Ladian is actually pretty interesting. You've got a 4-armed superhero with wings. It's got Iron Fist, so you know there's going to be a lot of punching attacks in there, which, of course, why wouldn't you with 4 arms? That'd be a fun one to give Air Slash as a projectile, U-turn as a burst movement option, which then takes you back to where you were, a relatively unique angle. Just a lot of those agile style moves that take advantage of the fact that it has wings. A tier. This one caught me off guard. I'll put it beside Palafin. Ladybug? That's a ladybug. I know the internet loves Bidoof, or loved Bidoof. I don't know why. Every now and then they pick a new funny looking Pokemon out of the hundreds of funny looking Pokemon, but alright, you win this round. As for Bibarel, the evolution which never seemed to get as much love, but also the more viable proper candidate. It's alright, it's based on a beaver, it could obviously do some attacks with that tail. I feel so little from it though. I'll give it C tier instead of D, which I was kind of considering because it's a water type, so it's got more moveset potential than something that's just a dog. It's kind of close to being just a beaver if we're being honest. Maybe also has a little more personality. If you want personality though, look no further than Dodrio. You got 3 of them to work with. Weirdly enough, you know, not bad. It's got a great body type for kick attacks, and anywhere you wanted to use arms, you can kind of substitute that with one of the side heads. It's another one of these Pokemon that's based around being clumsy. It's got Tangled Feet as an ability. It would be a fantastic candidate for Brave Bird, the flying type signature high damage but also damages you kind of attack. Because yeah, Dodrio is a flying type, which is totally nonsensical. It's obviously based on flightless birds, but it's there. Could also use Tailwind as a side special burst movement option, but you just run at them a lot faster than usual, maybe do some damage on contact. I can't believe I'm doing this, but A tier. I'd actually really like to see Dodrio. As for Doduo, I think if you're going to use 3 heads, use 3 heads. Parasect is kind of a crab, kind of a fungus. I think it's supposed to be based on a hermit crab, but it's a parasite that's taken over a mushroom. It can keep Crabrawler company, less Little Mackie, but I think worse in a vacuum. And Paris is considerably less interesting again. Blissey, again, I really like the Pokemon, but it's kind of hard to see this moving around Smash terrain particularly well. And it's a bit of a one trick. It's a very stally defensive cleric healer, self-healer kind of deal. That doesn't really work for Smash. It doesn't even have access to throwing eggs at people as an attack because it doesn't learn Egg Bomb in Pokemon. Why would it? It's trying to protect the egg on its body. If you did really want to force it into Smash, you could create a mechanic around that where it's got a weak point every time the egg is hit. That sounds like kind of a mess to make work though, because then you need to give it way bigger buffs in compensation, and it's not really that big to begin with. The egg takes up quite a bit of space. I have no interest in any of these eggs. And then the final entry in the surprisingly long lineage of Gen 1 egg Pokemon, Togepi. So the entire Togepi line is kind of interesting to look at. Going back to that Cynthia Pokemon trainer concept, she herself uses a Togekiss, and yeah, that one's kind of a write-off. That's just a flappy wings. But in Gen 4, she also famously gives the player a Togepi egg, so it's one she is pretty heavily associated with. Would it be functional as part of a swappable team? I'm gonna say yes, actually. It's very stubby, has short little limbs, but not necessarily more so than Jigglypuff. It could slap you around okay. But on top of that, kind of surprisingly, it's more of a mage-ish Pokemon. It learns a ton of long-range moves. And being in an eggshell, it could just hurl its entire body at you. That would actually work alright too. The middle evolution, Togetic, I'm gonna say is the body shape of the 3 of them that works the best, even if I personally find the egg shape maybe just a bit more interesting. Now, it is a middle evolution and those are awkward to work with, but it's got some merit of its own because this one gets a boost from being one of Misty's Pokemon in the show. Personally, I'm still very much in the mindset of if you're gonna do another Pokemon trainer, please don't make them from Gen 1 again, but you could argue some additional merit there. Put them all together, and Togekiss, even though I like it, is kind of a non-starter. Togepi and Togetic, I'm both gonna give a C tier to. You could make a case for either of them. Espathra, this is 2 things. It's a psychic special attacker and it's an ostrich. The psychic special attacker thing, yeah, been there, done that. It does have a signature move, Lumina Crash, which lowers special defense of the target, so you could interpret that as maybe being a slow projectile that does a lot of shield damage, something like that. The part that I am interested in is it being an ostrich, so it can use a lot of kick attacks, and it can run along the ground really fast, and it can attack with its single head. Oh. Yeah, I'd far rather see Dodrio, and honestly, I'd rather see Flamigo as well. And I'm not even really sure what Flittle is supposed to be. Cresselia. This one is Darkrai's counterpart, and as far as being a Smash candidate, I'm gonna say it drew the short straw. It's a decent shape at least, nice and upright, and it would feel comfortable hovering just above the ground. It's got a lot of cleric style moves, and it can knock itself out but restore health to the Pokemon coming in to replace it. Not super compatible. C tier, it's fine, it's got some stuff going on, and there is a theme to it. I'd much rather see Darkrai. Hatterene, a tall witch that attacks with its hat. That's fun. You may be asking a bit too much of that hat hand is the only thing though, because the rest of its body is just kind of one continuous shape. It levitates to get around, and that would work totally fine. A Mewtwo-esque animation, no walking required. But then when you try to actually flesh a moveset out of it, it has one limb to work with instead of 4, plus whatever psychic and fairy powers you want to give it. Doable, but does feel a little forced. Its signature move is Magic Powder, which in Pokemon transforms the target into pure psychic type. In Smash, you could have that powder cling to an opponent, maybe even attach it to multiple attacks, and then its Dark and Ghost type moves, which it does learn several of, those could be super effective and do additional damage and knockback. I've brought that typing system idea up with other Pokemon. I think it works decently well here. Put them all together and I'd say B tier. Not a ton of use for the pre-evolutions. I will say that Hatchrim walking around on its hair hat like that, I actually really like that body type, and you could totally see that being transplanted onto a workable fighting game character, but it's too different to be an Echo Fighter, and it's a pretty irrelevant middle evolution. Araquanid, the final spider Pokemon. I like it more than Galvantula. It's got some moveset potential attacking with water bubbles, it's got longer legs, still a pretty awkward body type at the end of the day though, and we've got better tanky water Pokemon, we've got better spiders. I'll give it D tier instead of F. Not you though. Tyranitar, a huge fan favorite, extremely powerful, extremely cool. Gen 2 pseudo legendary. It's the final one of these dinosaur slash Godzilla slash dragon designs that Game Freak loves to pump out. It's not necessarily the most ideal one for Smash though. It's not terrible, but it does have stubby arms, which would be kind of hard to make much use of, and it's extremely associated with Sandstorm in the Pokemon series. I think you could make better use of that than something like Rain, for example. Have attacks that just kick up sand and dust around it, and maybe have it be able to cloak itself in sand and provide some kind of effect. It's not necessarily the smoothest translation in the entire world, but with some effort, you could get that point across. Still a beast with a lot going for it. It's got those spines on its back that it could slam into you with, could create some really unique attacks out of that. It's a dark type, and it'd be a great candidate for Pursuit, a move that in Pokemon hits opponents even if they're switching out. So in Smash, you could get a huge damage boost if it connected with an opponent who was running away from Tyranitar. This would obviously be a pretty big, slow, lumbering Pokemon, so having a burst movement option that punished opponents for playing that hit and run game could be interesting. And then it also comes with a Paradox version, Iron Thorns, which in Pokemon I would definitely say is one of the most disappointing paradoxes. It's basically the same thing. It gets retractable spines and not much else, but why would you care if the spines are retractable? But in Smash, that translates to a built-in Echo Fighter. It's an A tier, but between being a huge fan favorite and having a great Echo, alright, I guess the bump into S. And Iron Thorns, up you go. Larvitar and Pupitar, its pre-evolutions, it's an interesting evolution line. I do like it, even if it is weird. Yeah, not great Smash candidates though. Salazzle, a speedy fire poison lizard with a lot of sass. That could actually be fun. In lore, they've got a strong poison gas theme to them. You're brushing up on the age-old problem of piranha plant, so that's not necessarily the direction you'd go. If you wanted to get away from the Pokemon systems, you could douse your opponent in toxic chemicals and then light those on fire. It's a nice way to incorporate the poison and fire typings, but really not faithful to the way Pokemon works. In fact, it's so unfaithful that it may even be a bit confusing and unintuitive. So why take that approach when you've got Pokemon with potential movesets that actually could work like that naturally? I say just ditch the fancy stuff. Make it a reptile that bashes at you and then throws in poison and fire moves, and it would work pretty well in that role. It's got long limbs, a great head for biting, a long tail. It could have Fire Lash as a shield breaking attack. I'm feeling A tier. Salandit, that's a rough go, especially if you're a male and you can't evolve. Kamala. This Pokemon is always asleep, and that's basically all you need to know about it. It spends its entire life asleep because the leaves it eats leach a sedative, and it can still battle while it's asleep. It can use stuff like sleep talk for free. That's nice. It's an interesting gimmick. I don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing with that for Smash though. Florges is a bit of a funny one. It's pure fairy type, funny enough. It really looks like it should have grass in there. It's got a few themes going on, none of which are especially great for Smash. It's kind of a cleric, kind of an allure style Pokemon. It's specially defensive. It is coming in with some fantastic costumes right off the bat. That's a point in its favor, but I think you need a little more than that. And beyond that, it just sort of waddles around, not doing a whole lot. I actually find its middle evolution Floette more interesting as a Pokemon, and there is some reason to look at it separately because it's got a form called Eternal Flower Floette, which won't evolve. In that case, using a big flower as a sword slash parasol, there is some gameplay inspiration there. It is encroaching on Peach's territory a bit for sure, but not as she plays in Smash yet. She could easily get reworked to incorporate more of the parasol though. And yeah, being real, I'd much rather leave room for that than just having some random flower Pokemon come in and fill that niche, but it is at least worth thinking about. Florges is like C tier at best. Floette I'll give B. Flabebe, the first evolution, I kind of like this one too, honestly. Riding around on the flower and controlling it is a totally different vibe, a little bit Bowser Jr.-esque. Arguably even more interesting and distinctive, but also not really necessary. Toxapex. This is a tiny little thing hiding inside a segmented dome. Picture this in Smash, it would be the most obnoxious design on Earth. Its pre-evolution Marini actually works way better because it's got a real body. Doesn't have much in the way of limbs, but the hair would actually work as a perfect substitute. But Toxapex is definitely going in F tier and Marini's just not important enough to rise above it. And then that just leaves us with Porygon, an evolution line that I've always had a huge soft spot for. Screw it, I know it's getting away from the rules a bit, but I want these guys to break the game. Literally. Put them in Smash and have some of their attacks ripping holes in the game. The particle effects open up voids where you can see that classic green and black scrolling binary code, that kind of stuff. Maybe certain attacks lower the opponent's frame rate when they're in it. I know that's not strictly speaking pulling from a Pokemon mechanic unless you consider it an allusion to Scarlet and Violet, but these are virtual Pokemon, right? I think it actually makes sense. Get just a bit meta with it without going too overboard. Porygon Z, the final evolution of the three, is definitely the most suited from a body shape perspective. It's got flippers that it can use as actual proper arms. It's more upright than the others. It's also by far my least favorite though. The original Porygon turning into Porygon 2 is one of my all-time favorite evolutions, going from low poly to high poly. It's clever, but because this is a virtual Pokemon and you're messing with the fabric of the game a bit, you could even maybe have it switch between all three forms. Make its default form Porygon Z, and then if it's doing a burst movement attack or something like that, or certain mobility options, have it switch into Porygon 2, and then when it's doing attacks that break the game world, switch into the original Porygon. The game is starting to break down, so you get the low poly version as it tries to compensate. I know I'm going off template here, but screw it. I don't know how many hours I've been talking about Pokemon at this point, and I love Porygon. I love it so much, in fact, that all three of them are getting S tier as a collective. Looking through and making a couple final adjustments before we wind things down. Pheromosa, I'm gonna move up one tier to D. I still don't like it. I still don't think it fits very well, but compared to some of the stuff down here, it's a bit harsh. It's at least coherent. I'm gonna do the same with Slacking. I really don't think you could translate its signature mechanic over at all, but you could at least impart some gist of it. And Hitmonchan, I think upstaged feels more appropriate than F. Ambor is also gonna get the upgrade. I still hate it. I still think it definitely does not need to be the firefighting rep, but if you wanted to, it works, and there are bigger sinners out there. Seismitoad, I'm gonna give a reluctant bump up as well. I don't hate it nearly enough to keep it down there with how functional it is. Diggersby, yeah, that can come up to B tier. It's doing something at least kind of interesting. I think the original Mr. Mime, that concept of a mime-based moveset is just too strong. It's gotta go up to A tier, which puts its Galarian form in an awkward spot since it evolves. I'll give it Echo Fighter territory though. And alright, sometimes string cheese tastes pretty good. And with that, I think we're done. This has been all 1,000 plus Pokemon ranked based on how well they'd fit into the next Smash game. This was, so much more of an ordeal than I ever expected it to be. It was fun though. I know statistically basically every Pokemon I've talked about in this series is going to be someone's favorite out there, so if you thought that I talked down on them too much or didn't put them in a good spot or spent too little time talking about them, I don't know what to tell you. Get better taste. Don't give me that look. I'm just doing what Game Freak does. Oh, did your favorite Pokemon not get a Mega Evolution? Sounds like you picked the wrong favorite. Alright, thanks for watching this behemoth I inflicted on myself, everyone, and hey, if you liked it, why not leave a like? You can check out another MockRock video here, a video on my second channel, MockRock Talk here, and patrons, YouTube members, and Twitch subs get perks like early videos and Discord access. Later, people.